Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for the story of Rayful Edmond III, the college kid who didn't just play the game. He owned the streets of Washington, D.C. at the height of the crack epidemic. A teenager in tailored suits, moving millions in product, and making the nation's capital his personal empire. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this little underworld grow across countries and time zones. Now, take a deep breath, let the noise of the day fade away, and prepare to step into the fast cars, bright lights, and dark corners of a city under the rule of its youngest kingpin. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The City Before the Storm. The air was thick with heat and tension, the kind that makes you sweat even in the shade. Sirens cut through the summer nights of Washington, D.C., but people barely flinched anymore. By the late 1970s, the nation's capital was a city fraying at the seams, its marble monuments and grand avenues standing like hollow set pieces, masking the decay spreading block by block. Poverty was not hidden in back alleys. It sat on porches, leaned on cracked stoops, and stared right back at you. There was a rhythm to the streets, but it was jagged, unpredictable, like a jazz record that kept skipping. On one side of town, politicians in pressed suits debated budgets under chandeliers. On the other, families counted coins for dinner while gunshots popped like distant fireworks. The gap between the two worlds wasn't measured in miles, it was measured in lives. For the city's working poor, opportunity wasn't just scarce, it was nearly mythical. A good job, a safe home, a steady paycheck. Those weren't promises here. They were lottery tickets, and most people never got to buy one. Drugs weren't new to Washington, but they were changing. Heroin had been the poison of choice through much of the 70s, creeping through alleyways and trapping whole neighborhoods in its slow, suffocating grip. But in the early 80s, something faster, cheaper, and far more addictive was on the way. Crack cocaine. It would not creep, it would sprint. It was a storm on the horizon, one the city was not ready to face. And yet, in certain corners, some were already watching that storm and thinking, not about shelter, but about profit. The neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River were the city's forgotten lands. Here, the sidewalks were buckled, the streetlights dim or broken, and the schools were bleeding teachers faster than they could replace them. Police drove through like tourists in an unsafe part of town. Quick, nervous, eyes forward. Residents learned to handle trouble themselves. And in the absence of order, new rules began to emerge. The kind you couldn't find in any book, but everyone knew by heart. Who to trust, who to avoid, whose name you never said too loud. It was in this fragile balance, where neglect met survival, that the seeds of an empire could be planted. The street corners were like chessboards, and the players knew the game well. A corner wasn't just a patch of sidewalk, it was a storefront without walls. Whoever controlled the corner controlled the flow. Whoever controlled the flow controlled the money. And in a city where money could get you almost anything, that meant power, real power. People remember D.C. in this era for its violence. The headlines told a relentless story: muggings, armed robberies, homicides. But behind those statistics were human faces, real lives pulled into the undertow. The teenager who joined a crew for protection and ended up dealing. The mother who worked 2 jobs but still lost her son to the streets. The old man who watched his block change so much he no longer recognized it. This was not a place where crime was an occasional disruption. It was the weather. Constant. Unavoidable. By the dawn of the 80s, crack had begun to surface in New York and Los Angeles, and word was spreading down the East Coast. Dealers spoke of it in whispers, like an urban legend that was all too real. Powder cocaine was for the wealthy, the lawyers, the nightclubs, the Capitol Hill insiders. But crack? Crack was for the streets. It was cheap, potent, and it delivered a high in seconds. The profit margins were absurd. A single kilogram of powder, cooked and broken down, could be flipped into tens of thousands of dollars, piece by piece. The early adopters in D.C. were not just chasing money, they were chasing dominance. In the drug trade, timing is everything. Be first, and you set the prices. Be late, and you're fighting over scraps. The city was a chessboard, but it was also a racetrack, and the ones who understood speed and territory were about to rewrite the rules entirely. In neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, the street economy offered a twisted kind of meritocracy. Nobody cared where you went to school. Nobody cared who your parents were. If you could move product, keep your crew loyal, and outthink your rivals, you could rise fast. And for some, the lure of that rise was irresistible. Not just because of the money, but because of what it meant to be feared, respected, untouchable. In a city where people were often invisible to those in power, the streets offered a spotlight. Dangerous, but blinding all the same. But this wasn't just a criminal playground. Law enforcement was evolving too. The Metropolitan Police Department was under pressure to show results, and the federal government was starting to pour resources into drug enforcement. The city's homicide rate was climbing, and there was political capital to be made in promising a crackdown. Still, in the early years of the crack wave, the police were always a few steps behind. They didn't fully understand the scale of what was coming or how quickly it could spread. Residents did. They saw the corners changing almost overnight. They saw the same faces every day, posted up, eyes scanning, hands busy. They saw the new cars that didn't fit the old neighborhoods. They saw kids barely out of their teens flashing cash like they had discovered a printing press in their basement. And they saw the cost, friends losing themselves to addiction, families tearing apart, the sound of gunfire closer and closer to home. It's easy to think of this era in statistics, murder rates, drug seizures, arrest numbers. But the truth is messier. The truth is that for every kingpin who made headlines, there were hundreds of smaller players, lookouts, drivers, couriers, all feeding into the machine. The machine didn't care who you were. It didn't care about your future. It only cared about the product moving, the money flowing, and the next corner to take. Washington, D.C. in the early 80s was a city living two lives at once. The political capital of the free world, where laws were written and history was made. And the murder capital of America, where life could be ended over a debt, a look, or the wrong step onto the wrong block. These worlds overlapped more than anyone wanted to admit. The suits downtown didn't always know, or didn't want to know, just how close the chaos was to their door. And into this environment, a city with one foot in marble halls and the other in blood-stained gutters, stepped a young man who understood both worlds. He could walk into a college classroom by day and command a street corner by night. He wasn't the first to try, but he would be the one to perfect it. In a way, the city had been waiting for him, waiting for someone who could read the streets like a book and see the bigger picture at the same time. Someone who understood that power wasn't just about muscle. It was about networks, about timing, about controlling not just what people had, but what they wanted. And in the late 1970s, as Washington stood on the edge of the crack explosion, those who were paying attention could feel it, like a storm cloud building over the skyline. The first drops were already falling, but the real downpour was still to come. The city's infrastructure, its police, its courts, its communities, was not built to withstand what was on the way. People like to talk about the crack epidemic as if it was an accident, a sudden disaster that no one could have predicted. But if you stood on the right corner in those years, you could see the future in plain sight. You could see the young men measuring themselves against the cars they didn't yet own, the gold chains they didn't yet wear, the stacks of cash they didn't yet count. You could see the ambition in their eyes, sharp, hungry, unblinking. This was the world that shaped Rayful Edmond III before he ever made a name for himself. A world where the rules of survival and the rules of success were starting to look the same. A world where the city's brightest lights could not hide the shadows growing at its edges. And while most of the city braced for the storm, somewhere in Northeast D.C., a young man was quietly preparing to step into it, not to run from it, but to ride it all the way to the top. The streets would be his lecture hall, the corners his boardroom, the city his empire. The question was never whether he would rise. The question was how high he could climb before the whole thing came crashing down. The answer would change Washington forever. And in the months to come, the name Rayful Edmond would mean one thing to the politicians downtown. and something entirely different to the people who lived in the shadow of the Anacostia. The city before the storm was about to meet the man who could control the weather. But first, the storm had to break. Chapter 2. The Edmund Legacy. The sound of the door closing was soft, almost polite, but it carried the weight of something final. In the dim kitchen light, a young boy sat at the table, small hands resting on the cool wood, watching his mother move with quiet precision. She didn't waste words. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the room like heat from a stove, steady, constant, impossible to ignore. That boy was Rayful Edmond, and before he ever stepped onto a street corner, before he ever held a brick of cocaine in his hands, he was learning lessons that no school could teach. His mother, Constance "Bootsy" Perry, was no ordinary parent. In Washington, D.C.'s northeast neighborhoods, her name traveled in the air like a warning and a promise. Bootsy wasn't loud about her business, but everyone knew she was a woman you didn't cross. She had built her own reputation long before Rayful was old enough to spell his name. In a world dominated by men, she had carved out her place in the city's shadow economy with a mix of grit, smarts, and an instinct for survival that was almost animal. Bootsy understood the streets the way a chess master understands the board. Every move measured, every risk calculated. She'd been part of the heroin game in the 70s, moving product in a network where trust was as rare as mercy. To outsiders, it looked simple: buy low, sell high. But to those inside, it was a delicate balance of timing, secrecy, and the ability to read people like open books. Bootsy had that gift, and she used it to keep her business alive when others were being swallowed whole. For Rayful, this was the air he breathed. Other kids learned life lessons from bedtime stories or schoolyard games. He learned them from watching deals get made at kitchen tables, from hearing his mother's voice drop low when she spoke to certain people on the phone, from noticing the way she counted money with a speed and precision that seemed almost mechanical. Money was never just money. It was control, it was leverage, it was the difference between being a player and being a pawn. He saw the respect she commanded. Men twice her size and twice her age lowered their voices around her, not because they feared violence, though they knew it was possible, but because they feared losing her trust. Trust, in the street trade, was a currency even more valuable than cash. And Rayful saw early that his mother spent it wisely. But with that respect came danger. Every transaction was a roll of the dice. One wrong move, one bad shipment, one disloyal associate, and the whole structure could come crashing down. Bootsy lived with that knowledge every day. She never said it out loud, but Rayful could see it in the way she kept the blinds drawn at night, in the way she memorized license plates of unfamiliar cars parked too long, in the way she sometimes stared at the phone as if it might speak before it rang. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival. In the drug world, threats didn't announce themselves. They slipped in quietly, like smoke under a door. And Rayful absorbed this awareness as naturally as breathing. The Edmund family wasn't one of wealth in the traditional sense, but they were far from powerless. In neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, their name carried weight. That weight could open doors, and it could close them just as quickly. Bootsy's reputation shielded her children from certain dangers, but it also placed them in the direct path of others. Being known in the street game was like standing in the middle of a busy intersection. You had to be fast, aware, and lucky just to keep moving. Rayful's father, Rayful Edmond Jr., had his own ties to the streets, but it was his mother's influence that truly shaped him. She was both the anchor and the engine of the family, holding them steady while always pushing forward. She didn't preach about ambition, she embodied it. And in doing so, she taught her son that power was something you took, not something you waited to be given. In the quiet moments, when the house was still, Rayful would think about what it meant to have a mother like Bootsy. She was both protector and strategist, willing to fight for her family, but always thinking 2 moves ahead. He admired her, but he also understood the cost of the life she lived. He saw the strain in her shoulders after a long day, the way her eyes scanned a room before she sat down, the way she kept certain truths locked away from even those closest to her. There's a certain gravity in growing up around that kind of presence. It pulls you in, shapes you, teaches you without ever having to spell out the lesson. Rayful learned early that strength wasn't about size or volume. It was about control. Control over your money, your moves, your image, and most importantly, your secrets. By the late 70s, the heroin market that had sustained many in DC's underworld was beginning to shift. The product was less pure, the profits smaller, the risks higher. And just as the old guard was feeling the squeeze, whispers of cocaine began to travel through the networks. Bootsy, with her sharp instincts, could sense the change coming. She didn't have to be told twice, adapt or be replaced. Rayful, still a teenager, was absorbing this in real time. He saw how quickly the game could evolve. One year, heroin was king. The next, it was yesterday's news. He understood that if you wanted to survive here, you couldn't just react. You had to anticipate. But Bootsy's lessons weren't only about business. She was teaching him about people. How to know when someone was lying without hearing the words. How to make someone feel like they were making their own decision when you'd already decided for them. How to give just enough to keep someone loyal without giving them the power to hurt you. These weren't street tricks. They were survival skills. And they would become the foundation of Rayful's rise. In the neighborhood, the Edmund home became a quiet landmark. Not flashy, not loud, but known. People came and went at all hours, but always with purpose. It was a place where deals were discussed, alliances formed, and disputes quietly settled before they became wars. Rayful saw it all, sometimes from the corner of a room, sometimes from the top of the stairs, listening to voices carry through the air. He learned that real power didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, and everyone else adjusted around it. For a boy with ambition, this was both an education and a temptation. Rayful saw the risks, but he also saw the rewards. He saw his mother move through the world with a confidence that no paycheck from an honest job could buy. He saw the respect she earned without ever raising her voice. And deep down, he began to imagine what it would be like to have that kind of control, not just over a block, but over an entire city. The streets were full of young men who wanted to be somebody. Most of them chased it with bravado, with noise, with quick moves that burned bright and ended fast. Rayful was learning something different. He was learning patience. He was learning that sometimes the smartest play was to wait, to watch, to let others make mistakes first. Still, the pull of the game was strong. The smell of fresh bills, the gleam of a gold chain, the knowing nod from a man twice your age, it was intoxicating. And for Rayful, it was more than just wanting those things. It was the realization that he was being prepared for something bigger, even if neither he nor his mother spoke it out loud. In D.C., the family name carried history. The Edmonds weren't outsiders trying to break in. They were part of the fabric. That came with connections, and with those connections came opportunity. Opportunity, in the street trade, is like oxygen. You can't survive without it. Rayful didn't yet know how he would make his move, but he was already storing away every lesson, every cautionary tale, every example of what to do and what never to do. He understood that success in this world wasn't about luck. Luck could get you in the door, but it couldn't keep you there. Staying there required skill, discipline, and the ability to think 3 steps ahead while making it look like you were just living in the moment. The bond between Rayful and Bootsy was unspoken but strong. She was raising him in a world where weakness was dangerous, where trust had to be earned, and where survival meant knowing when to be invisible and when to stand in the spotlight. He was her son, but he was also, in some ways, her apprentice. And as the 80s drew closer, with cocaine about to reshape the city's underworld, Rayful was ready. He didn't have a product yet. He didn't have a crew. But he had something just as valuable, the blueprint. The city was about to change forever. The rules were about to be rewritten. And when the first wave of crack hit DC, Rayful Edmond wouldn't be caught off guard. He would be waiting, the lessons of his family etched into his mind, ready to build something bigger than anyone in his neighborhood had ever seen. But first, he would have to step out of the shadow of the person who had taught him everything, and into a spotlight that would burn hotter than he could imagine. Chapter 3: Growing Up in the Shadows. The chain-link fence rattled as the ball slammed into it. the metallic clang echoing through the park. On the cracked asphalt court, a skinny kid in scuffed sneakers pivoted fast, eyes locked on the rim. He wasn't the tallest, he wasn't the strongest, but every movement had purpose, quick, deliberate, calculating. That kid was Rayful Edmond, long before his name would carry the weight of an empire. And even then, in the humid heat of a Northeast DC afternoon, he was learning how to win, how to read people, how to make the next move before anyone else saw it coming. Northeast DC in the late 1970s was a place of sharp contrasts. There was laughter in the streets, music spilling from radios, kids chasing each other through fire hydrant spray. But beneath that, there was a tension you could feel without anyone saying a word. Every block had its own set of rules. Some you could walk through freely. Others you crossed only if you had business there. And even then, you moved fast. It was a map you learned not from books, but from the whispers of older kids, the warnings from your mother, the way certain corners seemed to pull you in and push you away at the same time. For Rayful, the streets were not just a backdrop, they were a classroom. He learned how to gauge a man's intentions by the way he stood, how to tell if a story was true by the flicker in someone's eyes. The currency here wasn't just money, it was reputation. And reputation was built from the smallest moments. How you carried yourself, how you handled a loss, whether you kept your word when it counted. Sports were more than games in this world. They were arenas where neighborhood hierarchies were tested and established. On the basketball court, Rayful's style was sharp and efficient. He didn't waste movement, didn't waste words. He'd pass when the pass was right, shoot when the lane was open, and quietly take note of who argued calls too much, who cracked under pressure, who could be counted on when the score was tight. It was the same kind of assessment that would one day decide who stood beside him in business and who didn't. Around him, the street economy hummed in the background like an endless low-frequency sound. It was in the handshake between two men leaning against a lamppost. It was in the quiet handoff at the back of a corner store. Even as a boy, he saw it. Packages changing hands, money folded discreetly into palms, the unspoken understanding that transactions didn't need receipts. He wasn't part of it yet, but the patterns were becoming familiar. And he noticed something else. Status had a visual language. It was in the way someone wore their clothes, the cut of their hair, the car they drove, even if the block they lived on was crumbling. Status could be bought, but it had to be maintained, like a fire that needed constant tending. You could climb the ladder, but one wrong move and you'd fall faster than you'd risen. Rayful's home life kept him close to the currents of the street. His mother's work in the heroin trade meant people came and went with the kind of presence that left an impression. Men who spoke in measured tones, who wore their confidence like armor. Women who moved quietly, but whose eyes missed nothing. There was a seriousness in those interactions that didn't exist in the schoolyard or the court. And Rayful, even as a child, paid attention. He was also learning something many kids never did, that in his neighborhood, trust was never blind. A man could laugh with you today and plot against you tomorrow. A favor given could turn into a debt called in at the worst possible time. And sometimes, the person you thought would stand beside you would disappear the moment the pressure hit. These weren't just lessons, they were warnings, engraved in memory. Still, childhood wasn't without joy. There were summer nights when the air was filled with barbecue smoke, the sound of Motown from open windows, the steady hum of neighbors talking on their stoops. There were block parties where for a few hours, the boundaries between crews softened and kids ran free under the streetlights. But even then, there were rules, unspoken but enforced. Who you spoke to, who you avoided when you went home. The city itself seemed to shift depending on where you stood. The federal buildings downtown gleamed under the sun, their flags waving, the sidewalks spotless. But cross into the wrong neighborhood, and the streets told a different story. Vacant lots overgrown with weeds, boarded up row houses, playgrounds with swings missing. Rayful grew up in both worlds, aware that the city's heartbeat wasn't set by Congress or monuments, but by the rhythms of the neighborhoods that official maps didn't mark in bold. At school, Rayful was smart enough to keep a low profile. Drawing too much attention, good or bad, could make you a target. Teachers noticed he was bright, but he didn't show all his cards. Among friends, he was respected without being loud. Someone whose opinion carried weight even when he wasn't the one speaking the most. That ability to blend, to be present without drawing the spotlight until he wanted it, would become one of his greatest tools. In the neighborhood, the pecking order wasn't fixed. It shifted with each new hustle, each change in the street's economy. Someone could go from respected to forgotten in a month, from feared to dismissed in a week. Rayful learned that stability didn't come from brute force alone. It came from consistency, from being reliable in a place where reliability was rare. There were moments, small ones, but sharp, when he caught glimpses of what power looked like up close. The way people stopped talking when a certain man walked into the room. The way arguments dissolved at the sound of a single voice. The way a debt could be forgiven or doubled with nothing more than a look. These moments left an imprint. They showed him that power wasn't always loud or messy. Sometimes it was quiet, almost invisible, but undeniable. And while the streets could be dangerous, they were also a stage. Young men displayed what they had like actors in a play: shiny chains, fresh sneakers, new cars with speakers loud enough to shake windows. But Rayful understood early that the show wasn't the whole story. Behind the display, there were calculations, debts, alliances, and rivalries that could shift overnight. He knew that the smart players weren't always the ones making the most noise. As he moved through his teenage years, the shadows became more familiar than the light. He could navigate a block without looking over his shoulder because he already knew who might be behind him. He could sense when trouble was coming, the way the air seemed to tighten before a fight broke out. And he knew when to stay still and let the storm pass without him. Sports remained his outlet, but even there, the street's influence crept in. Bets were placed on games, side money changed hands, and reputations were built or broken over a single shot. The court wasn't just a place to play, it was a proving ground. And Rayful, quiet and calculating, made sure he was the kind of player people wanted on their side. The drug trade wasn't his yet, but it was around him every day. The corner boys, the middlemen, the runners, they were part of the scenery. He watched how they moved, how they handled heat from the police, how they dealt with rivals. He saw who rose and who disappeared, and he took note of the patterns, the mistakes, the moves that worked. It's easy to think of childhood as a time of innocence, but for Rayful, it was more like an apprenticeship. The lessons weren't written down, but they were clear. Know your surroundings, control your image, never let your emotions make your decisions, and always keep something back for yourself. As the 1980s approached, the city was changing. Heroin was fading, and cocaine was beginning its rise. The first whispers of crack were starting to reach D.C., carried by word of mouth from New York and Los Angeles. The older dealers were skeptical, but the younger ones saw possibility. And Rayful, still just a kid in the eyes of many, was watching closely. He didn't know yet how he would make his move, but he knew this much: when opportunity came, it wouldn't wait around. The streets had a way of offering the door only once. Miss it, and you could spend the rest of your life watching someone else walk through it. And in those quiet moments, lying in bed at night, the sounds of the city drifting in through the window, Rayful imagined a future where he wasn't just part of the neighborhood. He was the one shaping it, the one others adjusted their moves for, the one with the kind of influence that reached from the courts to the corners, from the stoops to the skyline. But influence comes with a price. And in the streets of Northeast D.C., that price was always high. Soon, the game he'd been studying from the sidelines would come calling. And when it did, the boy who grew up in the shadows would have to decide whether to step into the light or become part of the darkness that had always been there, waiting for him. Chapter 4. From Schoolyards to Street Corners. The bell rang, and the crowd spilled out of the high school doors like a river breaking its banks. Some kids walked home in tight packs, others loitered near the basketball court, dragging out the day just a little longer. Rayful was among them, but he wasn't wasting time. His eyes scanned the flow of students, catching nods from some, smirks from others. He wasn't the loudest voice in the crowd, yet somehow he was always at its center. You didn't notice him first, but you noticed that people noticed him. In those days, his hustle didn't look like a hustle. It looked like helping a classmate score a pair of sneakers before anyone else had them, or getting a hold of the new cassette that hadn't yet hit the local record store. It looked like small favors and casual trades, the kind of deals that could pass as harmless. But harmless was just the surface. Beneath it was something more deliberate. Each exchange was a thread, and Rayful was weaving them together into a net, one that, in time, would catch far bigger things. He learned early that money was only part of the game. Influence mattered just as much. A dollar could be spent once, but trust could pay off again and again. He had a gift for making people feel like they were in on something with him, like they were part of a shared secret. In a city where most kids his age were hustling to be noticed, Rayful was hustling to be needed. It started small, selling candy at a markup between classes, getting hold of designer jackets from a cousin who worked in retail and flipping them for a profit. Nothing flashy enough to draw real heat, but enough to make sure his pockets were never empty. He moved like a kid testing the edges of a swimming pool before diving in, never reckless, but never still. The street corners were never far away. In Northeast D.C., they were like open-air offices, each one belonging to someone, each one carrying its own set of rules. Rayful spent more time observing than participating at first. He knew the players, knew who ran what corner, knew which guys kept things tight, and which ones were sloppy. He learned that a corner wasn't just a location, it was a statement. Hold a corner, and you held the eyes of everyone who passed through it. But Rayful didn't rush to plant his flag. He understood that the fastest way to lose in the street game was to play it too soon. So he kept blending his worlds. By day, he was a student, an athlete, a young man with a promising smile and clean sneakers. By night, or in the in-between hours, he was learning the street's language fluently. How to talk without saying too much, how to ask questions without making it seem like you were fishing for answers. Social intelligence was his real currency. He could move between the lunch table and the street corner without either side feeling like he didn't belong. The athletes saw him as one of them. The hustlers recognized his potential. The girls noticed his calm confidence, and the teachers, for the most part, thought he was just another kid trying to make it through. He was building bridges in every direction, and each one could be crossed when the time came. The pull of the street was magnetic. Rayful saw the older guys with their polished cars, their gold watches, their pockets full of cash. He saw the way people stepped aside when they walked by, the way their names carried weight. But he also saw the other side, the arguments that turned into fights, the sudden disappearances, the quiet news that someone had been locked up or worse. It was a game with no mercy, and he understood that long before he played his first real hand. What set him apart was patience. Where others rushed to grab the first opportunity, Rayful waited for the right one. He was like a chess player who didn't just look at the next move, but the one after that, and the one after that. Every small hustle was a practice round. Every relationship was a potential piece on the board. He wasn't just trying to get ahead. He was preparing for something bigger than most of the people around him could see. There were moments when the two worlds overlapped, when a deal that started in the schoolyard ended on the street, or when a favor owed in the neighborhood was paid back during school hours. Rayful handled those moments with care, never letting either world feel like it was being used. He made the blend seamless, so that if you asked someone who he was, you might get two completely different answers, and both would be right. The corner crews noticed him. They saw the way he carried himself, the way people came to him instead of the other way around. They saw that he had connections that didn't seem to come from one single place. Some tried to pull him in early, but he didn't bite. Not yet. He knew that once you stepped onto that corner officially, the clock started ticking. Every day after that was a countdown, and he wasn't ready to start his timer. In the meantime, he studied the economics of the street without ever calling it that. He saw how one guy would buy bulk from another, then break it down and sell it smaller for more money. Simple multiplication in motion. He saw how someone with the right supplier could control a whole area just by keeping the quality high and the prices stable. He saw how violence wasn't just about anger. It was about maintaining a reputation, sending a message that would save you from having to send another one later. But the street also taught him that reputation could be fragile. A single mistake, a single missed payment, could erase months of careful work. Fear could get you power, but respect could keep it. And the smartest players found a way to have both. At school, Rayful's hustle stayed clean enough to avoid serious trouble. He knew the line and never crossed it in daylight. He didn't need to. The real moves were being made in the spaces between. The short walk from school to the store, the quick conversation outside a parked car, the meeting at a friend's house where nobody else was invited. He was building layers, and each one was designed to protect the one beneath it. His friends noticed that he always seemed to have what people needed: money for lunch, tickets to a game, the latest fashion. But they didn't see how each of those things was part of a larger plan. To them, he was just generous. To Rayful, it was an investment. Every smile, every handshake, every favor done without being asked was a deposit in a bank that didn't deal in dollars. The street corner and the schoolyard were different worlds, but they ran on the same principles: competition, alliances, the constant pressure to stand out without being exposed. Rayful thrived in both because he never forgot the most important rule: information was worth more than anything you could hold in your hand. He listened more than he spoke, remembered more than he repeated. Still, temptation was never far. The streets were heating up, and the money moving through them was faster than anything a side hustle could match. Older guys flashed rolls of cash that could pay a family's rent for months. Cars with out-of-state plates pulled up quietly and left even quieter. The city was shifting, the old drug markets giving way to something leaner, faster, and far more profitable. Crack cocaine hadn't yet swallowed DC whole, but the first ripples were being felt, and the sharpest minds could already see the wave coming. Rayful could feel it too. The way conversations on the corner changed. The way certain people started showing up with new jewelry seemingly overnight. The way the older players suddenly seemed more guarded, more watchful. He didn't yet know exactly what was coming, but he knew it would change the rules. For now, he stayed in the middle ground, close enough to feel the pull, far enough to keep his freedom. But that space was narrowing. Opportunities were starting to present themselves in ways that were harder to ignore. Bigger profits, faster returns, more influence. The kind of offers that made you ask not whether you could take them, but whether you could afford not to. And in the quiet moments, lying awake at night, Rayful thought about what it would mean to step fully into the game. He knew it would mean more money, more respect, more of the things he'd been building toward since those first schoolyard trades. But he also knew it would mean risk, real risk, the kind that couldn't be undone with a smile or a favor. The street corner was calling, and the longer he waited, the louder it got. Chapter 5, College by Day, Kingpin by Night. The lecture hall was quiet except for the scratch of pens on paper. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust motes hanging in the air like tiny, suspended secrets. Rayful sat near the middle, not in the front where the professor's eyes lingered, and not in the back where whispers and drifting attention gave away disinterest. He listened, nodding at the right moments, his notes neat, his posture calm. To anyone watching, he was just another student at the University of the District of Columbia, a young man chasing a degree, blending into the flow of campus life. What they didn't see was that, less than 12 hours earlier, he'd been standing in a dimly lit apartment, the smell of cash and cocaine mixing in the air. They didn't see the quiet instructions he'd given to his crew, the numbers running through his head, the deals set in motion that would ripple through half the city before the sun came up. By day, Rayful was a college student. By night, he was something else entirely. He had learned to live in two worlds at once, and he was getting better at it with each passing week. The university was, in many ways, the perfect cover. A campus filled with thousands of faces, a rotating schedule, and no single person tracking his movements from hour to hour. He could disappear into a class, walk across the quad unnoticed, leave for lunch, and handle business miles away without raising suspicion. Professors saw potential. Classmates saw charisma. The streets saw a leader. Few realized they were all looking at the same man. Balancing both lives required more than time management. It required precision. The drug trade wasn't a 9-to-5 job. It was a constant pulse, an engine that didn't stop running just because you had a test in the morning. Supply lines had to be maintained. Crews had to be managed. Territories had to be protected. And every decision had to be made with the understanding that one misstep could bring it all crashing down. For Rayful, the university wasn't just a place to earn credits. It was a place to build connections. He met people from neighborhoods he didn't yet control, students with relatives in cities that could open new supply routes, even young professionals who had access to spaces the street couldn't reach. Every handshake, every casual conversation was a potential thread in the network he was weaving. But the pull of the street never loosened. Even while sitting in class, his mind would drift to the corners, to the quiet phone calls, to the status reports from his crew. The streets had a rhythm, and he was always tuned to it. It was like listening to two songs at once, one playing softly in the background of academia, the other pounding in his chest from the life he had built outside it. There were nights when he would leave a late study session and drive straight to a meeting with his suppliers. The contrast was surreal. 1 hour, discussing literature or political science. The next, negotiating kilos and profit margins with men whose handshake could mean opportunity or danger. It was the kind of double life that could break a lesser man. For Rayful, it was a challenge, and he thrived on challenges. The logistics alone were a puzzle. The product coming into the city had to be moved quickly and cleanly. Safe houses had to be maintained, and lookouts kept in place. Money had to be laundered through legitimate fronts, while the visible signs of wealth had to be carefully balanced, not too much to draw heat, not too little to lose face. He was young, but he understood that success in the drug game wasn't about chaos. It was about control. And control required discipline. In the daylight world of campus life, discipline meant showing up to class on time, handing in assignments, and maintaining an air of normalcy. In the night world of the street, discipline meant keeping your crew in line, managing disputes before they turned into bloodshed, and making sure no one knew more than they needed to. The dual existence gave him an edge. The streets respected that he was in college. It wasn't common, and it hinted at a bigger vision than most young hustlers carried. The campus, on the other hand, had no idea just how much weight his name carried beyond its gates. To them, he was simply well-dressed, confident, and always in motion. But living like this came at a cost. Sleep was often a luxury, and trust was something he could never give freely. Every conversation had to be measured, every movement calculated. He had to remember which version of himself each person knew, and keep those versions from colliding. In a sense, he was playing two different games on two different boards, making moves in one that could never be revealed in the other. The danger was constant. Police cruisers on the street were a threat in one world, but just background noise in the other. A professor asking why you missed class could be nothing, or it could be the beginning of a question you couldn't afford to answer. The smallest slip could send cracks running through the careful structure he had built. Still, there was power in the balance. The college world gave him a kind of invisibility. No one suspected the well-spoken student was moving product at a scale that dwarfed most of the city's crews. And the street world gave him resources that made the small struggles of student life seem trivial. If he needed money, he had it. If he needed a car, it was there. If he needed influence, it was a phone call away. It was during this period that his network began to expand rapidly. The money coming in was unlike anything most people his age could imagine. But with that money came new decisions: where to invest it, how to protect it, and how to keep it from drawing the wrong kind of attention. The stakes were getting higher, and so were the risks. The truth was, Rayful was no longer just moving through the street game. He was shaping it. His operation had reach, speed, and efficiency. The corners under his control moved product faster than police could respond. And yet, every morning, he could walk onto campus with a backpack slung over his shoulder, blending into the sea of students without anyone realizing they were brushing past one of the most powerful young men in Washington, D.C. There were moments when the two worlds nearly collided. A familiar face from the street showing up near the campus. A conversation overheard that didn't belong in a classroom. A phone call that couldn't wait until after the lecture. Each time, he managed to smooth it over, to keep the lines from crossing. But he knew it was only a matter of time before the edges started to fray. The discipline that kept him afloat was also what kept him climbing. He wasn't reckless with his power. He calculated every move, knowing that in both the academic and the street worlds, reputation was everything. One bad impression could close a door forever, whether that door led to a business deal or a supply line. As the semesters rolled on, his name on the streets grew louder. The product was high quality, the prices consistent, and the organization behind it smooth enough to avoid major disruptions. But success attracted attention, both from rivals and from law enforcement. The quiet cover of college life wouldn't be enough forever. Rayful understood this, but he also knew that every day he kept both worlds running was another day his influence deepened. The longer he could maintain the balance, the stronger his position would be when the inevitable confrontation came. And yet, in the back of his mind, there was a question he couldn't entirely silence. How long could anyone walk this tightrope before gravity took over? For now, he moved forward. By day, a student with papers to write and exams to study for. By night, a kingpin with an empire to expand and protect. 2 lives, 2 games, 1 man, and the line between them was getting thinner. Chapter 6. The crack wave hits. The first time it appeared on the streets of Washington, it looked harmless, almost small enough to ignore. Little off-white rocks, wrapped in plastic, passed hand to hand so quietly they barely made a ripple. But those who tried it knew instantly that this was different. It hit harder, faster, and deeper than anything they'd felt before. And in the shadows of the nation's capital, the ripple became a wave. By the mid-1980s, crack cocaine had already chewed its way through neighborhoods in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. It was more than a drug, it was an economic weapon. Cheap to produce, easy to transport, and devastatingly addictive, it could transform a single kilogram of powder cocaine into dozens of smaller, far more profitable packages. Dealers called it rock, a name that didn't hint at the destruction it carried. For the sellers, it was a gold rush. For the users, it was quicksand. Washington, D.C. was primed for it. The city's heroin trade had weakened, leaving gaps in the market. Unemployment was high, wages low, and many neighborhoods had been stripped of resources for years. The streets were already familiar with the drug trade. There were networks in place, corners ready to be claimed, and crews hungry for the next big thing. Crack didn't just arrive in D.C. It landed in a place already set to explode. What made crack different was its reach. Powder cocaine had always been the drug of choice for the wealthy, the lawyers, lobbyists, and socialites. But crack brought the high to the working class, the unemployed, the teenagers on the corner. It was cheap, often less than $10 a hit, and the high was immediate. In a city where money was tight and stress was constant, that was enough to create a customer base overnight. The economics were brutal and simple. Dealers could take a single kilogram of powder, cook it into crack, and break it down into hundreds of tiny rocks. Each rock sold fast, and the money came back quicker than any other hustle on the street. A corner that once made hundreds a day could suddenly make thousands. And in the hands of an organized crew, those thousands became tens of thousands, every single week. The spread was like a storm rolling through the neighborhoods. One week, a block would be quiet. The next, it would be busy from sunrise to long past midnight. Addicts came in waves, some from across town, some from just around the corner. Fights broke out over territory, alliances formed and broke just as quickly, and the sound of gunfire became part of the city's nightly soundtrack. Law enforcement was caught off guard. The old strategies, targeting mid-level dealers, hitting stash houses, weren't enough. The product was too small, too easy to move, too quick to replace. A raid might clear a corner for an afternoon, but by nightfall, business was running again. Police scanners crackled with calls, but even the officers knew they were chasing smoke. For the people living in the neighborhoods, the change was impossible to ignore. The foot traffic on certain streets doubled. Strangers appeared and disappeared at all hours. The small-time hustlers who once scraped by were now flashing cash, wearing gold chains, driving cars they couldn't have dreamed of a year earlier. And behind every one of them, there was someone supplying the product. That someone, in more and more cases, was Rayful Edmond. He saw what crack could do, both to people and to the market. Where others saw chaos, He saw opportunity. The profit margins were unmatched, and he had the connections to bring in a steady, high-quality supply. In a city where competition was fierce, quality mattered. Addicts talked, and word traveled fast about whose product hit the hardest. Rayful wasn't the first in D.C. to sell crack, but he was the one who took it to a scale the city hadn't seen before. His operation moved with speed and precision, flooding the market while keeping prices steady. In the drug world, that kind of stability built loyalty, not just from customers, but from the dealers working under him. If they moved his product, they got paid on time, every time. That reliability kept his network tight, even as the money and risks grew. But the same qualities that made crack profitable also made it dangerous. The high wore off quickly, driving users back to the corner again and again. Addiction spread fast, tearing through families, emptying bank accounts, and leaving children to fend for themselves. The city's crime rate surged: burglaries, robberies, assaults, anything to get the money for the next hit. The violence between rival crews escalated, each trying to hold onto the corners that were now worth more than ever before. Washington, once known as the political heart of the nation, was gaining a new title: the murder capital of America. The statistics were staggering. Homicides rose year after year, with drug disputes at the center of many. Every territory was a battlefield, and every corner was a potential war zone. Rayful navigated this chaos with the same discipline he'd always had. He kept a low profile in public, but his presence on the street was undeniable. His crew operated with military-like organization. Lookouts were stationed to spot police or rivals. Stash houses were spread out to minimize losses if one got hit, and money was counted and moved with an efficiency that rivaled legitimate businesses. The wave of crack didn't just reshape the streets, it reshaped the city's power structure. New players rose quickly, but most fell just as fast, swallowed by violence, greed, or law enforcement. Rayful, however, climbed steadily. His connections, his supply chain, and his ability to manage people put him above the chaos. In a market where most were thinking about the next day, he was thinking about the next year. But even he couldn't control everything. The sheer volume of crack moving through D.C. drew attention. More police, more reporters, more federal interest. Community leaders called for action, while the Reagan administration ramped up its war on drugs. Crack became the headline, the talking point, the public enemy number one. And in the middle of it all, Rayful's empire was growing. Every kilo he moved fed the wave, pushing the city further into the grip of the epidemic. The profits were staggering, but so was the damage. Families were breaking apart. Neighborhoods were collapsing under the weight of addiction and violence. And while Rayful was making more money than ever, the storm he was helping to drive was drawing closer to him. In the coming months, the crack wave in Washington would reach its peak. The streets would be flooded, the body count would rise, and the competition would grow more desperate. And for Rayful Edmond, the question wouldn't be whether he could ride the wave, it would be whether he could survive it. Chapter 7. The Los Angeles Connection. The deal was set for midnight, in a city more than 2,000 miles from home. The air in Los Angeles was warmer, drier than Washington's, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and the ocean. But for Rayful Edmond, the only thing in the air that night was opportunity. He wasn't here for the palm trees or the neon lights. He was here to shake the hands that could change his life, and the city's, forever. By the mid-1980s, Los Angeles was more than Hollywood and freeways. It was a major hub in the American cocaine trade, a gateway for product coming straight from the jungles of Colombia. The Medellin cartel, led by names whispered with fear even in the States, was flooding the country with powder. And the crews in L.A. had direct lines to that supply, lines most dealers in D.C. could only dream about. Rayful was already a rising power back home, his operation moving crack faster than the city could breathe. But the game he was in had a ceiling, and he could see it. Local suppliers meant higher prices and unpredictable quality. Worse, it meant dependence on middlemen who could raise prices or cut him off without warning. To keep growing, he needed to break free from that chain. He needed a source, a real one. The introduction came through mutual contacts. people who moved in the spaces between music, nightlife, and the street. In the drug world, introductions are never casual. Every handshake is a calculated risk. A meeting like this wasn't just about trust, it was about leverage. If the LA crew liked him, he'd get his shot. If they didn't, he might never leave the room. The meeting place wasn't flashy. Just a modest house on a quiet street, blinds drawn, lights dimmed. Inside, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke. On the table sat packages wrapped tight, stacked like bricks waiting for a wall to be built. Each one represented tens of thousands of dollars in potential profit, and the kind of risk that could bury a man if he wasn't careful. They talked in low voices, the LA crew asking questions that were less about the product and more about the man in front of them. Could he move weight consistently? Could he keep heat off their operation? Could he pay on time, every time? In the drug trade, reputation traveled faster than money, and the word on Rayful was already good, disciplined, organized, and ambitious. The deal they offered was unlike anything he'd seen before. High-purity cocaine, straight from the source, at a price that would crush his competitors back in D.C. No more relying on inconsistent local supply. No more worrying about someone cutting the product and ruining its reputation. With this pipeline, he could flood the city with quality so pure it would dominate the market overnight. But the connection wasn't just about product, it was about scale. With Medellin's reach behind him, Rayful could move more weight, more consistently, than anyone in Washington's history. It was the difference between running a profitable hustle and building an empire. And he knew it. Flying back to D.C., he carried no drugs, just the weight of the opportunity he'd secured. The city below him when he landed looked the same, but to Rayful, it was already different. Every corner, every crew, every dealer moving product in the city, they were all about to feel the impact of his new supply line. Within weeks, the change was obvious. The purity of his product set it apart immediately. Addicts could tell. Dealers could tell. The word spread faster than the product itself. Rayful's stuff hit harder, lasted longer, and was worth every dollar. Corners that sold his product moved it faster than they could restock, and the money flowed back up the chain with astonishing speed. For Rayful, the LA connection meant more than profits. It meant control. In a market where rivals were constantly trying to undercut each other, he could keep his prices stable and still outsell them. And in the drug trade, stability wasn't just good business, it was power. Crews wanted to work for him because they knew the product would never dry up and the money would never be late. But every step up the ladder meant a higher fall if something went wrong. The pipeline from Colombia to LA to DC was a delicate one. A missed shipment, a seized load, a single betrayal could unravel everything. And the Medellin cartel wasn't forgiving. Rayful managed it with the same discipline that had brought him this far. He kept the network tight, the information compartmentalized. Only the people who needed to know the details knew them, and even then, they only knew their part of the chain. It was a system designed to survive pressure from police, from rivals, from anyone looking to break in. But success breeds attention, and the volume of cocaine now moving through his operation was impossible to ignore. The streets felt it. Rivals noticed. And somewhere in an office downtown, federal agents were starting to connect the dots between a college-aged man in designer suits and a sudden spike in high-purity cocaine on the streets of the capital. The LA connection had given Rayful exactly what he wanted, a steady, powerful supply line and the leverage to dominate DC's drug trade. But it had also tied him to an international network where a mistake wasn't just bad for business, it could be fatal. Back in his hometown, the money was flowing, the corners were his, and his name was spoken with both respect and fear. But in the shadows of that success, a question began to form, not just in the minds of his rivals, but in his own. When your power depends on a pipeline built thousands of miles away, how long can you really control it? Chapter 8. An industrial-scale operation. The money came in so fast it had to be counted in shifts. Stacks of bills, bound tight with rubber bands, filled grocery bags, duffel bags, cardboard boxes. The room was always warm, not from the weather, but from the sheer body heat of people working nonstop to sort, stack, and seal the cash. This wasn't a hustle anymore. It wasn't even just a business. By the mid-1980s, Rayful Edmond was running an operation that looked less like a street crew and more like a corporation with a payroll, departments, and rules. Except the product was illegal, and mistakes could be fatal. The streets of Washington, D.C. were carved into territories, each corner and block as valuable as a prime storefront in a high-rent district. Rayful controlled the most profitable of them. Key neighborhoods where the demand for crack was constant and where his crews worked like clockwork. At the very top of the chain was Rayful himself, the architect, deciding what moved where and how much. Beneath him was a small circle of trusted lieutenants who oversaw whole sections of the city, each responsible for dozens of street-level sellers, runners, and lookouts. Every layer of the operation had its role. At the street level were the sellers, the ones who put the product in the hands of customers and kept the corners alive. Above them were the runners, moving fresh product in and taking cash back out. Then came the stash house managers, who guarded the larger supplies, breaking down kilos into smaller quantities and packaging them for distribution. And above them were the lieutenants, men and women who managed the crews, settled disputes, and kept everything running smoothly. At full strength, Rayful's network employed hundreds. Some estimates put it close to 1,500 people at its peak, directly or indirectly tied to his business. It wasn't just dealers. There were drivers, enforcers, lookouts, couriers, and even people whose only job was to count money and make sure it was ready to move to the next stage. Like any large company, there were specialists for every part of the process. The scale of it was staggering. On a busy weekend, his operation could move tens of thousands of vials of crack across the city. The product came in pure, courtesy of the Los Angeles connection, and stayed that way. No cutting, no dilution. That kept customers coming back, and it made his corners the most sought-after spots in the city. Working for Rayful meant steady income, better product, and the protection of an organization that could enforce its rules without hesitation. The system ran on discipline. Corners opened on time and stayed stocked. Payments moved up the chain with precision. There was no chaos, no scrambling to replace lost product, no confusion over who handled what. Even in the heat of the crack epidemic, where violence was an everyday risk, Rayful's crews operated with an efficiency that law enforcement couldn't ignore. Protection was part of the structure too. Lookouts, often kids barely in their teens, were posted on rooftops, corners, and stoops, ready to signal at the first sign of police or rival crews. Enforcers kept order, both within the organization and on the streets, making sure that disputes didn't escalate in ways that could threaten business. Rayful didn't tolerate unnecessary violence. It was bad for business, but when force was needed, it was decisive. The money flowed upward like water through a system of pipes. Street sellers brought in cash daily, which moved to mid-level managers, then up to the lieutenants, and finally to Rayful. It was counted, bundled, and in many cases laundered through fronts and legitimate businesses. The sheer volume of cash was a problem in itself. Hundreds of thousands of dollars coming in every week, often in small bills, all of it needing to be moved, hidden, or washed before it drew too much attention. From the outside, it might have looked like a series of random street corners doing their own thing. But behind the scenes, every corner was a gear in a larger machine, turning in sync with the rest. If one gear broke, the others compensated until it was fixed. That kind of resilience didn't happen by accident. It was the product of careful planning and constant oversight. Rayful didn't need to be on the corner himself anymore. He could spend his nights in nightclubs, his afternoons in college classrooms, and still know that his network was operating at full strength. His lieutenants knew their roles, and his crews knew the rules. The structure allowed him to step back from the day-to-day street work and focus on expansion, bringing more corners under his control, tightening the supply chain, and making the operation even harder to penetrate. But the size of the empire made it a target. Rivals saw the money and wanted their share. Law enforcement saw the scale and knew they were dealing with something far beyond the average drug crew. Federal agencies began pooling resources, sharing intelligence, and mapping the web of Rayful's operation. Every new corner under his control brought more profit and more attention. The scale also meant the stakes were higher for everyone involved. A street-level bust might barely touch the supply, but a betrayal from inside the organization could be catastrophic. Rayful managed this risk the way he managed everything else, through loyalty, fear, and opportunity. Those who stayed loyal were rewarded. Those who broke the rules didn't get second chances. The operation's reach was such that, by the height of his reign, Rayful Edmond wasn't just running a drug crew. He was running a shadow economy. In certain neighborhoods, his money paid rent, kept lights on, and put food on tables. Some saw him as a villain destroying their community. Others saw him as a provider, someone who gave back when no one else would. That duality, feared by some, respected by others, was part of what made him untouchable for so long. But industrial-scale operations are harder to hide. The bigger the machine, the more moving parts there are for someone to see, hear, or talk about. And as the crack epidemic tightened its grip on Washington, the machine Rayful had built would draw the kind of attention that no amount of discipline could deflect forever. The empire was running at full capacity, the money and product flowing in perfect rhythm. But the same system that made Rayful powerful was also creating a paper trail of whispers, rumors, and evidence that his enemies, both on the street and in law enforcement, were starting to follow. And as they closed in, the question wasn't whether they could find the machine. It was whether they could figure out how to stop it without tearing the entire city apart. Chapter 9. Rules of the Street. The first rule was simple: keep business clean. No wild talk in public. No names on the phone. No extra eyes where they didn't belong. The second was even simpler: loyalty comes before everything. And the third, the one that everyone in Rayful Edmond's orbit understood without ever having it written down: if you cross him, there is no fourth chance, no third, and usually not even a second. Rayful wasn't the kind of leader who ruled by constant yelling or random bursts of rage. He didn't need to. His power came from control over himself, over his people, over the pace of the game. In a city where chaos was the background noise, his organization moved like a symphony, every player knowing their cue, every note hitting at the right time. That precision wasn't just about efficiency, it was about survival. Discipline was the backbone of everything. Corners were stocked on schedule. Runners moved like clockwork. Money was counted, bundled, and moved without delay. Rayful didn't tolerate sloppiness. In his world, a missed detail could snowball into a lost shipment, a police raid, or a shooting war. And he knew that in the drug game, the line between thriving and bleeding out could be as thin as a single bad decision. Loyalty, for Rayful, wasn't just an expectation, it was a currency. He rewarded those who stayed true with better product, better positions, and the kind of protection that made working for him safer than working for almost anyone else in the city. People who were loyal to Rayful didn't just get paid, they moved up. Those who weren't vanished from the picture, one way or another. Violence, when it came, was never random. He didn't believe in drawing heat just to make a point. But when a point had to be made, it was made in a way no one forgot. A rival crew trying to poach his corner might wake up one morning to find the spot completely stripped and their top seller gone. A mid-level dealer skimming money might get one quiet warning. If it happened again, they wouldn't get a second. Rayful's violence was like a scalpel, precise, targeted, and meant to solve a problem permanently. This style kept his organization unusually stable for the crack era. Many crews in DC imploded under the weight of paranoia, constant infighting, or reckless displays of power. Rayful's people, by contrast, knew the rules, knew the consequences, and knew that as long as they played their part, they would eat. In a business built on distrust, that was a rare kind of security. He led from a position that blended distance with presence. He didn't hover over every street deal, but he was never so far removed that his people forgot who made it possible. His lieutenants enforced the rules, but they enforced them in his name. That name alone was often enough to prevent problems before they started. Rayful also understood the street psychology. Fear could keep people in line, but respect could make them willing to protect you. He wanted both. Fear without respect meant people would turn on you the moment they saw an opening. Respect without fear meant they might start thinking they could get away with testing you. By maintaining the balance, he created an environment where betrayal was rare, not because it wasn't possible, but because it wasn't worth the cost. He didn't waste energy proving himself to everyone. His proof was in the smoothness of the operation, the quality of the product, and the speed with which he could resolve problems. Those who worked for him understood that being part of his organization meant playing by his rules. Those who didn't want to play by them didn't last long enough to cause real damage. But the streets are never static. Every corner was a potential battleground, every handshake an agreement that could sour overnight. Rayful's rules worked because they were flexible enough to adapt to these shifts. If a neighborhood heated up with police activity, he'd pull back, shift resources, and wait it out. If a rival made a bold move, he wouldn't respond out of pride. He'd respond when and how it would hurt the most. Calculated patience was one of his most dangerous traits. In a world where impulsive retaliation was the norm, Rayful would wait days, weeks, even months before making his move. By then, the target often thought they were safe. That false sense of security made the impact even sharper when the hit finally came. Inside his own ranks, the rules bred loyalty not just to him, but to the structure he'd built. People knew their roles and what was expected. A street seller didn't need to know where the product came from. A lieutenant didn't need to know exactly where the money ended up. Each piece of the puzzle was kept separate so that if one part fell, the others could keep running. This compartmentalization wasn't just smart, it was necessary. The more people knew, the more they could talk if they were caught. And in the crack era, law enforcement was starting to squeeze harder than ever. Federal task forces were being formed. Wiretaps were going up. Informants were flipping. Rayful's rules were as much about keeping the police out as they were about keeping his people in line. Still, for all his discipline and control, the streets had a way of testing even the best systems. Rivals didn't stop coming. Temptations didn't stop calling. And every man in his network, no matter how loyal, carried his own fears, ambitions, and secrets. Rayful's rules kept the empire standing. But the larger it grew, the harder it became to ensure every piece followed them to the letter. And in the shadows of Washington, D.C., cracks, small, almost invisible, were beginning to form in the structure he had built so carefully. Soon, those cracks would widen. And when they did, the same rules that had protected him might not be enough to save him. Chapter 10, Flash and Power. The flashbulbs popped as he slid into his courtside seat, the hardwood just a few feet away. The Washington Bullets were in the middle of a tight game, but for some in the arena, the real show was sitting on the sideline. Rayful Edmond didn't hide in the shadows like most kingpins. He stepped into the spotlight, tailored suit crisp, gold glinting at his wrist, diamonds catching the light every time he adjusted his cuff. The streets already knew his name. Nights like this made sure the rest of the city did too. In the mid-1980s, most big dealers avoided public attention. Low profile meant less heat from rivals, less attention from the police. Rayful turned that playbook on its head. He didn't flaunt for the sake of showing off. Every display was deliberate, a calculated piece of theater. The clothes, the jewelry, the cars, they were symbols. They sent a message. This was a man who had made it to the top of one of the most dangerous games in America, and he wasn't afraid for anyone to know it. The suits came from the best tailors, cut sharp and fitted perfectly to his frame. The shoes were imported, polished to a mirror shine. The jewelry wasn't just expensive, it was heavy, substantial, impossible to ignore. Gold ropes thick enough to be seen from across the room. Diamond pieces that seemed to sparkle even in low light. On the street, these were more than accessories. They were armor, status, and advertisement all in one. Rayful's rides were just as carefully chosen. Sleek European imports with leather interiors and tinted windows, American luxury sedans with custom features. The kind of cars you noticed even if you weren't looking. Pulling up in one wasn't just about transportation. It was about announcing his arrival without saying a word. In clubs, he commanded attention without raising his voice. VIP sections weren't just where he sat. They became his personal stage. Bottles flowed, music thumped, and people gravitated toward him, drawn by the mix of charisma, mystery, and the unspoken knowledge of who he was. Being in Rayful's orbit was its own kind of currency. For some, it meant opportunity. For others, it meant protection. For a few, it meant danger. But the Flash wasn't just about impressing strangers. It was about reinforcing his place in the hierarchy of the streets. In an environment where power was constantly challenged, appearances mattered. A man who looked like he was winning was less likely to be tested. A man who looked untouchable was more likely to stay that way. The courtside seats, the designer fits, the gold, it all fed into the image of a kingpin who had nothing to fear. That image had ripple effects. Young hustlers in D.C. looked at Rayful and saw a blueprint. He was proof that you could rise fast, live large, and do it while still walking through the city you controlled. He wasn't some faceless supplier hiding in another state. He was present, visible, and thriving. Of course, that visibility came with a price. The police noticed. The feds noticed. Even politicians began to recognize his face. In a city already under national scrutiny for its murder rate and drug violence, the sight of a young black man barely in his 20s, dressed better than most executives, sitting courtside at NBA games didn't go unnoticed in official circles. To law enforcement, the Flash wasn't just arrogance, it was a challenge. Rayful understood the risk, but he also understood the psychology. Fear kept enemies away. Respect kept allies close. But envy? Envy kept his legend alive. Every story told about the night he rolled into the club in a brand new Mercedes. Every whispered account of the gold chain that cost more than a row house. Those weren't just tales. They were recruitment tools, loyalty builders, intimidation factors. He was careful, though. The Flash never crossed into recklessness. No public drunkenness. No sloppy scenes in front of cameras. His display of wealth was always controlled, curated, as if he knew the line between looking powerful and looking like a target. And for a time, it worked. The image of the young, stylish kingpin solidified, and the myth around his name grew. But myths have a way of drawing more eyes than you want. And as Rayful's public profile grew, so did the number of people watching, recording, and waiting. For now, though, the lights stayed bright. The gold kept shining, and the seats stayed courtside. In Washington, D.C., there was no mistaking it. Rayful Edmond was at the top, and he wanted everyone to see exactly what that looked like. Chapter 11, Robin Hood of the Blocks. The electric bill was due, and the notice on the door was final. The lights would go out by morning. A mother of 3, working 2 jobs and still behind, stood in her kitchen staring at the paper like it might change its mind. Then came the knock, 3 soft taps, no rush. A folded envelope slid across the table minutes later, thick with cash. No words exchanged except, "Don't worry about it." This was how it happened, over and over again in neighborhoods across D.C. during the height of Rayful Edmond's reign. In a city drowning in the violence and addiction of the crack era, here was a man who, to some, didn't just take. He gave. He paid rent for struggling families, covered funeral costs when tragedy struck, and dropped off groceries for homes where cupboards were empty. For those on the receiving end, it didn't matter where the money came from. It mattered that it came at all. Rayful understood the power of generosity in a world where opportunity was scarce. On the streets, money wasn't just currency. It was influence, loyalty, and a kind of insurance policy. By helping the people around him, he built a wall of protection that no bulletproof vest could match. The community watched his back, sometimes literally. Strangers became lookouts. Neighbors turned blind eyes to police questions. Even those who hated what crack was doing to their streets felt an obligation to the man who had kept their lights on or made sure their kids had coats in the winter. He didn't just give in private. His reach extended into public spaces, block parties with music and food where every kid got a new toy, basketball tournaments with shiny trophies, and crisp new uniforms. These events weren't small gestures, they were spectacles. For a few hours, the corners were quiet, the streets were full of laughter, and people could forget the grip crack had on their lives. In neighborhoods long ignored by city leaders, Rayful filled the void. Politicians made promises every election season. Rayful delivered without speeches. When the community center needed repairs, he found the money. When the local team needed jerseys, he made it happen. It wasn't charity, it was strategy, and it was brilliant. To the outside world, this seemed like contradiction. How could the man flooding the city with crack also be the one putting food on tables? But on the blocks, it was simpler. People separated the destruction from the man. They knew crack was killing their neighborhoods, but they also knew that no one else was stepping up. For some, the help outweighed the harm, at least in the short term. Rayful's giving also had a darker, practical side. Acts of kindness created debts that couldn't be repaid in cash. They built bonds that made betrayal harder and silence easier. A family he helped keep in their home was far less likely to answer police questions. A man whose son he put through school was far less likely to switch sides in a street dispute. It wasn't just goodwill, it was calculated loyalty, cemented with generosity. Still, there were those who saw through it. Pastors who refused his donations. Parents who told their kids not to take his money. Community leaders who warned that accepting his help was like making a deal with the devil. Sooner or later, you'd pay for it. But their voices were often drowned out by the music from his block parties or the cheers from the basketball courts he sponsored. The myth of Rayful as a modern-day Robin Hood grew with every good deed. Kids who had nothing wanted to be like him. Young men saw his life as proof that you could rise from the same cracked sidewalks and be respected, feared, even, without needing anyone's permission. He was living proof that the system could be beaten, and he was doing it in style. But myths have shadows, and his was no exception. For every bill he paid, there was a family burying someone lost to addiction. For every party he sponsored, there was a corner where his product was sold, where fights broke out and bullets flew. His generosity didn't erase the destruction. It just blurred the edges for those close enough to benefit from it. In the end, his giving wasn't just about being a hero. It was about control. The streets loved him because he made them feel seen, protected, and, for a moment, free from the weight of their struggles. And in return, they gave him something no money could buy: silence. But silence can only hold for so long. And as Rayful's empire grew, so did the destruction that followed in its wake. Eventually, even the people who called him a hero would have to face the cost of what his generosity had built. Chapter 12, Counting Millions. The smell of money isn't crisp or clean. It's heavy, almost metallic, with a faint trace of the hands that have passed it along. In Rayful Edmond's world, that smell hung in the air like humidity. The room where the counting happened was never truly quiet. The soft snap of rubber bands, the steady shuffle of bills, the low murmur of counters calling out numbers. It was the soundtrack of an empire. At its peak, Rayful's operation was pulling in an estimated $2 million every week. Not in checks, not in wire transfers, cash. Piles of it. Small bills, mostly 20s, hundreds packed tight into bricks, stacked in grocery bags, shoe boxes, and cardboard cases. The kind of volume that no bank could handle without questions and no legitimate business could explain. The money didn't move once a week, it moved every day. Every corner sent in its take by nightfall, the cash flowing upward through layers of the organization like water through pipes. Street sellers passed it to runners, runners to mid-level managers, and managers to the people who counted for the top. By the time it reached the highest level, it had been handled, bundled, and verified by hands trained to spot a missing dollar in the middle of a pile that could buy a house. In this game, speed was survival. The longer cash sat in one place, the greater the risk of theft, of raids, of rivals. Rayful's operation ran like a relay race. One team collecting, another counting, another moving it to safer ground. Sometimes the money was laundered through small businesses. Sometimes it was hidden in stash houses, stuffed into walls, buried in basements. And sometimes it was simply moved out of the city entirely, carried in duffel bags by trusted couriers. The counting itself was a process. People worked in shifts, fingers flying over stacks, rubber bands snapping tight around neat bundles. Accuracy mattered. Every dollar had to be accounted for. In a business where trust could evaporate overnight, the books had to be exact, even if those books were nothing more than numbers in someone's head. Skimming was a risk, but in Rayful's world, anyone caught taking more than they earned knew they wouldn't get a warning. Handling that much money changed the way people thought. $2,000 in a night became routine. $10,000 in a week was expected. After a while, the value of a dollar blurred, replaced by the value of stacks, bundles, and bricks. But the danger of dealing only in cash was constant. It was bulky, hard to hide, and it left a trail, even if it wasn't on paper. The sheer volume also drew attention. A flashy car or a diamond chain could be brushed off as style, but large amounts of unexplained cash had a way of reaching the wrong ears. Law enforcement knew the signs: sudden spending, purchases that didn't match income, stacks of bills moving around neighborhoods with no legitimate reason. The DEA and FBI were already starting to look at Washington's drug money, and Rayful's operation was near the top of their list. But for now, the machine kept running. The money kept moving. The cash kept piling up in hidden rooms, behind locked doors, inside walls, under floors. Every week, another $2 million flowed through his hands, faster than most legitimate companies could dream of earning. And as long as the product moved and the corners stayed his, the counting would never stop. At least, not yet. Chapter 13. The Murder Capital Era. The gunfire didn't always come at night. In Washington, D.C., during the height of the crack epidemic, daylight offered no safety. Shots could ring out while kids walked to school, while mothers carried groceries, while old men sat on stoops trying to escape the heat. It was the sound of a city tearing itself apart, one corner at a time. By the late 1980s, the nation's capital had earned a grim new title: the murder capital of America. Crack was the fuel, but territory was the match. Every block with steady traffic was worth fighting for, and every fight had the potential to end in blood. Crews guarded their corners like kingdoms, and any encroachment, real or imagined, could start a war. Rayful Edmond's network dominated the most profitable spots, but power like his was a beacon. Rivals wanted in, and they were willing to die for the chance. The violence wasn't just calculated hits. It was constant, chaotic, and often personal. A dealer might get shot over a dispute as small as a few $100s or as large as a stolen shipment. Retaliation was swift, and cycles of revenge spiraled until neighborhoods became battlefields. In some parts of D.C., you could measure the weeks by the funerals. For Rayful, control meant more than moving product. It meant keeping his empire intact in the middle of this storm. His crews had rules about when and how to use violence, but rules didn't mean peace. The sheer number of people in the game, each with their own loyalties and grudges, made bloodshed inevitable. By 1988, DC's murder rate was climbing toward a record high. That year, the city saw more than 400 homicides, a staggering number for its size. Police were overwhelmed. Detectives worked cases back to back, often arriving at one crime scene while still carrying notes from another. Witnesses were scarce. Fear of retaliation kept mouths closed. In neighborhoods where Rayful's name carried weight, that silence was even deeper. The murders sent ripples through the community. Parents warned their kids about which streets to avoid, which colors not to wear, whose name not to say. Streetlights flickered over empty sidewalks as people stayed inside after dark, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't trust the night. Still, business continued. Dealers adapted to the violence, moving in tighter units, using lookouts not just for police, but for rival crews. Enforcers, men whose only job was to protect territory, became more common. Guns were everywhere, from cheap revolvers to high-powered rifles, and the sound of them became so familiar that some residents barely flinched when they heard it. The violence also drew more attention from the media. Headlines screamed about the chaos, painting D.C. as a city out of control. National news anchors stood in front of crime scene tape, telling viewers across the country about the war in the nation's capital. Behind the scenes, federal agencies began pouring resources into investigations, determined to break the networks feeding both the drugs and the bloodshed. For Rayful, the murder capital era was both a sign of his dominance and a warning. His organization had weathered the chaos better than most. His rules kept many of his people alive, but the heat was rising. the more bodies dropped, the more political pressure there was to take down the men at the top. And his name was starting to come up in those conversations. But on the streets, the killings didn't slow. The profit margins were too high, the stakes too real. Every empty corner left by a murder was quickly filled, and every new crew that rose up was met with a challenge. The city was locked in a cycle, money flowing in, bodies hitting the pavement, corners changing hands. And at the center of it all was a man who could walk into a neighborhood and make everything stop, or make it start again. Yet even for Rayful, control had limits. In the murder capital of America, the next gunshot was never far away. And one day, one of those shots might come for him. Chapter 14, Law Enforcement Locks In. The case began, as most do, with fragments. A series of street arrests that didn't add up. Anonymous tips whispered to detectives. Surveillance photos of young men in designer clothes standing on corners where the traffic never stopped. Each piece alone meant little. But together, they pointed towards something larger. An operation so organized, so profitable, that it couldn't be just another neighborhood crew. By the late 1980s, Rayful Edmond's name had moved beyond street rumor. It was being spoken in briefing rooms, written into memos, and circled on charts in law enforcement offices across Washington, D.C. To the police on the ground, he was the face of the crack epidemic's most powerful empire. To federal agents, he was a case that demanded coordination like the city had never seen before. The violence tearing through D.C. had turned national attention toward the city's drug trade. The murder numbers were climbing, the press was relentless, and political leaders were demanding results. This wasn't just about stopping street-level dealers anymore. It was about taking down the men at the top. And for the DEA, the FBI, and the Metropolitan Police Department, that meant one target: Rayful Edmond III. The task force they built was a rare thing. Agencies that often guarded their turf now sharing intelligence, pooling resources, and working side by side. DEA agents brought expertise in tracing supply lines. FBI teams handled long-term surveillance and organized crime investigations. MPD detectives provided local knowledge of neighborhoods, rival crews, and Rayful's movements. Together, they formed a single unit with one mission: dismantle his empire from top to bottom. They started with the basics, following the money. In a cash business, paper trails are thin, but not invisible. Agents tracked flashy purchases, from imported cars to luxury real estate. They monitored associates known to handle large sums, hoping a slip in discretion would open a door. Every new piece of information was mapped out on corkboards: names, phone numbers, addresses, and photos connected by lines of string. The web kept growing, and at the center of it, always, was Rayful. Surveillance became a constant. Agents sat in unmarked cars for hours, cameras ready. They tapped phones, recording snippets of coded conversations. They watched stash houses and meeting spots, logging every face that came and went. The work was slow, tedious, and often frustrating, but patience was part of the strategy. To take him down, they needed more than arrests. They needed a case airtight enough to hold in federal court. Informants were another weapon. The task force flipped low-level dealers caught with enough product to face long sentences, offering reduced time in exchange for information. Every name they gave, every location they described, was checked and double-checked. The hope was to work their way upward, climbing the ladder until someone close to Rayful cracked. But Rayful's operation wasn't easy to penetrate. He compartmentalized his network so tightly that most of his people only knew their piece of the puzzle. Street sellers didn't know stash house locations. Couriers didn't know suppliers. Even lieutenants didn't have the full picture. It was a structure designed to survive raids and arrests, and for a long time, it did. Still, the task force found ways in. Wiretaps began to reveal patterns, voices that appeared repeatedly, code words for product and money. Surveillance teams caught sight of Rayful himself, moving between college classes, high-end clubs, and quiet neighborhoods where meetings took place behind closed doors. Each sighting went into the file, building the narrative piece by piece. The agents knew they were up against more than just a drug dealer. Rayful was a businessman, a strategist, and a community figure with a layer of protection that came from the very neighborhoods being torn apart by his product. People feared him, but they also respected him, and that made finding cooperative witnesses harder than ever. Inside the task force, the pressure was unrelenting. Every month without an arrest meant another month of murders, overdoses, and territory wars. The public wanted a headline, politicians wanted a victory, and the agents wanted to end a reign that was making their city unrecognizable. But this wasn't a game they could rush. One bad bust, one case dismissed for lack of evidence, and Rayful would vanish into the shadows for good. So they waited, watching, listening, building. The net was tightening, but it had to be thrown at exactly the right moment. And as winter turned to spring, the task force believed they were getting close. The conversations on the wiretaps were becoming clearer. The supply lines were taking shape. The faces in the surveillance photos were starting to match the names on their charts. Rayful Edmond didn't know it yet, but the hunters were locked in. And when the move finally came, it would be swift, loud, and aimed straight at the heart of his empire. Chapter 15: Surveillance and Wiretaps. The microphone was hidden inside a telephone receiver, its wires running through a wall into a listening post parked quietly a block away. In the back of a van, two agents sat with headphones pressed to their ears, hearing voices that didn't know they were being overheard. The conversations were short, coded, and cautious. But every so often, a word slipped through, a name, a number, a location, that made someone in the van reach for a pen. By the late 1980s, the task force hunting Rayful Edmond knew they couldn't take him down with street-level arrests or lucky breaks. His organization was too disciplined, too compartmentalized, and too well-protected. If they wanted him, they'd have to see the whole picture. That meant getting inside without ever stepping through the door. The wiretaps were the first breakthrough. Federal court orders allowed the DEA, FBI, and Metropolitan Police to intercept calls from suspected members of Rayful's crew. But these weren't the kind of calls where someone said, "Bring me a kilo." Rayful's people spoke in codes and metaphors, asking for tickets or shirts, talking about parties or visits. To an outsider, it sounded like harmless chatter. To a trained ear, it was the language of an empire. Decoding that language took time. Agents logged every call, cross-referencing details with surveillance reports, arrests, and informant tips. Over weeks and months, patterns emerged. Certain voices always called before large movements of product. Certain numbers were only dialed at night. Certain phrases, innocent enough on the surface, always preceded spikes in activity on key corners. While the wiretaps captured voices, the surveillance teams followed bodies. Unmarked cars shadowed suspected couriers from stash houses to meeting spots, sometimes staying with them for hours. Long-lens cameras clicked from rooftops and parked vans, snapping images of handshakes, bag exchanges, and quick conversations through open car windows. It was grueling work. Sitting in a freezing car at 2 in the morning, staring at the same doorway for hours, waiting for someone to appear. Following a vehicle through city traffic without being noticed. Watching a target walk into a building and not come out for days. Patience was as much a weapon as the technology itself. The agents knew they had to be invisible. One wrong move, a shadow spotted in the rearview mirror, a camera lens catching the wrong glint of sunlight, and months of work could be undone. Worse, it could spook the entire organization into changing routines, switching phones, abandoning stash houses. Every observation had to be clean. Human intelligence, informants, added another layer. Low-level dealers facing long prison terms were offered deals in exchange for information. Some provided addresses of stash houses. Others described meeting procedures or named people higher up the chain. A few even wore wires into meetings, recording conversations that, while still coded, gave the task force invaluable context for what they were hearing on the phones. The combination of human and technical intelligence began to map the outlines of Rayful's empire. They could see the hierarchy, who answered to whom, who handled money, who moved product, who made decisions. They tracked the supply lines from Los Angeles to D.C., noted the safe houses, and built profiles on his closest associates. But Rayful himself was harder to catch. He rarely touched the product, rarely handled the money directly, and often moved in ways that seemed designed to frustrate surveillance. He would show up at unexpected places, leave through different exits, and keep his personal conversations brief and vague. Even on the phone, he spoke like a man who knew someone might be listening. The agents adapted. They layered surveillance, multiple cars following a single target, teams switching out mid-route so no one was on too long. They rotated phone monitoring duties so fresh ears might catch something a tired one missed. They paired physical surveillance with the wiretaps so they could match a call's content with a target's movement in real time. Over months, the task force's walls filled with photographs, charts, and timelines. Red string linked faces to addresses, phone numbers to cars, calls to meetings. The picture was coming into focus. They could see the rhythm of the organization, the surges of activity when new shipments came in, the lulls when money was being moved or laundered, the bursts of violence when territory was challenged. Still, they knew they hadn't cracked it completely. Rayful's network was disciplined enough that the most critical conversations likely never touched a phone line. The goal wasn't to catch every detail. It was to gather enough evidence from enough directions to make the case undeniable in court. And with every intercepted call and every frame of film, they were getting closer. The walls of his empire were still standing, but for the first time, someone on the outside could see exactly where the foundations were. It was only a matter of time before they found the pressure point and pushed. Chapter 16, The Informant Web. The first one flipped quietly, without headlines or drama. A low-level courier caught with a trunk full of product, staring down decades in federal prison. Faced with the choice between losing his life to a cell or talking, he chose to talk. Not everything, never everything, but enough to open a door. And once one door opened, more followed. The task force knew from the start that Rayful Edmond's operation couldn't be taken down by surveillance alone. His network was too disciplined, too insulated. He rarely touched the drugs or the cash directly, keeping himself a layer removed from the risk. If they wanted to connect him to the crimes in a way that would hold up in court, they needed voices from the inside. People who could say, "I was there. I saw it. I did it for him." Flipping an associate wasn't just about dangling a lighter sentence. It was about pressure, fear, and leverage. The DEA, FBI, and MPD learned the personal details of their targets, family situations, debts, rivalries, grudges. They looked for cracks, and once they found one, they applied pressure until it split wide open. Some cooperated to save themselves, others to protect their families, and a few out of pure self-interest, betting they could give just enough to secure their freedom while holding back enough to keep a foothold in the game if they ever got out. But whatever the motive, each one added a new thread to the growing web of testimony against Rayful. The stories began to overlap. A lieutenant described picking up shipments flown in from Los Angeles. A stash house manager detailed how the product was broken down, packaged, and moved out to the corners. A runner explained the system for delivering cash back up the chain, sometimes hundreds of thousands in a single night. The details were precise enough that the agents could match them with their surveillance logs and wiretap transcripts, creating a layered, cross-verified picture of the operation. But working with informants was dangerous for them and for the investigation. If word got out that someone had flipped, it could mean retaliation on the streets. The task force kept identities secret, using code names and moving some into protective custody. Meetings took place in unmarked cars, back rooms, and anonymous hotel suites, often in the middle of the night. The informants didn't just provide information, they provided translation. Those coded conversations on the wiretaps suddenly made sense when paired with an insider's explanation. A party wasn't a celebration, it was a shipment. A new pair of shoes meant a new stash spot. A visit to the tailor was picking up money. With every decoded phrase, the agent's understanding of the network sharpened. Some informants were more valuable than others. A few were close enough to Rayful to describe his habits, his routines, even his temperament. They painted a picture of a man who was calm under pressure, methodical in business, and deeply aware of who could be trusted. But they also revealed moments of vulnerability, times when he showed frustration, moments when his patience thinned, hints of the human side behind the legend. Piece by piece, the case took shape. The surveillance showed movement. The wiretaps captured the voices, and the informants filled in the gaps, explaining the why and the how. The prosecutors now had what they needed to build a conspiracy case, one that could tie Rayful to the drug trade at a scale no defense attorney could dismiss as coincidence. But with every new informant, the stakes rose. The more people talked, the greater the chance that someone inside Rayful's camp would sense betrayal. The agents knew they were racing against time. If Rayful discovered the leaks before they made their move, the entire web could collapse, informants disappearing, evidence drying up, and the case stalling before it reached court. For now, though, the net was holding. The threads were tight, the connection strong. The task force could feel it. They were close to pulling it closed around the man who had seemed untouchable. And when they did, it wouldn't just be one arrest. It would be the unraveling of an empire. Chapter 17, the 1989 Takedown. It began before sunrise, when most of the city was still asleep. The streets of Washington were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air is holding its breath. But behind that stillness, engines were idling, radios were whispering, and armed men in black vests were waiting for the green light. For months they had been watching, listening, gathering every scrap of information they could. Now, the plan they had built in secrecy was about to unfold. And when it did, it would shake the capital to its core. The targets were spread across the city: stash houses, apartments, meeting spots, even family homes. The strategy was simple but unforgiving. Hit them all at once. No warning, no chance to run, no time to make a single phone call. The goal wasn't just to arrest Rayful Edmond. It was to rip out his entire network in one coordinated strike. In the language of law enforcement, it was called a takedown. On the streets, it felt more like a sudden eclipse, the kind of darkness that changes everything in an instant. Inside the command post, maps of DC were covered in colored pins, each marking a location where a team would hit. Some pins represented key lieutenants, others were mid-level managers, and a few marked spots known to hold cash or product. At the center of it all, circled in red, was Rayful. His arrest was the crown jewel of the operation, but the agents knew it had to be done in a way that left no gap for the Empire to regroup. At precisely 4 a.m., the radio crackled, "Execute." In seconds, the city's silence shattered. Doors splintered under battering rams. Flashlights cut through dark hallways. Commands barked out in sharp bursts. "Police, don't move," echoed through stairwells. Helicopters hovered overhead, their blades chopping the air into an ominous rhythm. Rayful's arrest was swift but tense. Agents moved in with practiced precision, their weapons raised, every angle covered. He was awake, alert, but he didn't fight. The man who had commanded hundreds on the street, who had moved millions of dollars in product, simply raised his hands and let the cuffs close around his wrists. To those who had chased him for years, it was the moment they had been working toward. To him, it was the moment he had known, somewhere deep down, would eventually come. Across the city, the other raids were unfolding with equal force. In some locations, suspects tried to run, bolting through back doors or scrambling over fences, only to be met by agents lying in wait. In others, there was no resistance, just the dull acceptance of men and women who had seen enough of this game to know when it was over. By sunrise, dozens of people connected to Rayful's operation were in custody. Some were street-level workers, others were trusted insiders. All of them represented a piece of the puzzle the task force had been building for more than a year. The seizures told their own story. Kilos of cocaine, carefully wrapped and labeled. Bundles of cash stacked in closets and stuffed under floorboards. Weapons, handguns, shotguns, even military-grade rifles, lined up on evidence tables. Each piece was a fragment of the empire that had turned Washington into the epicenter of the crack epidemic, and now, piece by piece, it was being dismantled. Word of the raids spread fast. By mid-morning, The neighborhoods Rayful had once ruled were buzzing. On some blocks, people whispered about who had been taken. On others, the talk was louder, edged with disbelief. How could someone so powerful, so untouchable, be sitting in a police van right now? For years, Rayful had walked those streets like he owned them. That morning, the image shattered. But not everyone celebrated. In the communities where Rayful had paid bills, sponsored events, and handed out cash, there was a quiet unease. Some saw his fall as the loss of a protector, however flawed. Others feared what would come next. Without his control, rival crews might move in, bringing even more chaos. Arresting a kingpin didn't erase the demand, and it didn't erase the vacuum left behind. In the media, the story hit like a thunderclap. Local news led with footage of agents in tactical gear, boxes of evidence being carried out, and aerial shots of raid locations. National outlets picked it up, framing it as a major victory in the war on drugs. The narrative was clear. The government had struck at the heart of DC's drug trade, taking down its most infamous figure. Inside the task force, there was a sense of satisfaction, but it was laced with caution. They knew that arresting Rayful was not the same as convicting him. The case they had built was strong, supported by wiretaps, surveillance, informant testimony, and physical evidence. But the trial would be its own battlefield. And in the drug world, influence didn't always stop at the jailhouse door. For Rayful, the ride from the arrest site to the federal holding facility was quiet. He didn't speak much, didn't ask questions. If anything, he seemed to be taking mental inventory of the faces around him, of the chain of events that had led to this moment. To some agents, it looked like resignation. To others, it looked like calculation. By noon, the city was in a different mood. The morning's adrenaline had faded, replaced by speculation. What would happen to the corners now? Who would try to fill the gap? Would the violence slow, or would it spike? And the question that hung over it all, would Rayful talk? The raids had stripped his operation of much of its manpower, but no one believed the machine was entirely shut down. Pieces of it were still out there, money hidden, products stashed, loyalists unaccounted for. The task force knew it, and so did Rayful. Taking down an empire wasn't like turning off a light. It was more like cutting power to a building where some of the rooms still had candles burning. That day in 1989 was a turning point. For law enforcement, it was proof that patience, coordination, and intelligence could bring down even the most powerful networks. For the streets, it was proof that no one, not even the man who had seemed untouchable, was beyond reach. But as the sun set over the city that evening, there was no clear sense of victory. The arrest was a headline, yes, but the deeper question remained unanswered. Was this the end of Rayful Edmond's reign, or just the end of its first chapter? Chapter 18, The Trial of the Century in D.C. The jurors filed in slowly, eyes fixed ahead, not daring to glance toward the defense table. The courtroom was tense enough to feel like a living thing, its silence broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional cough from the gallery. At the center of it all, wearing a tailored suit instead of the designer streetwear he was known for, sat Rayful Edmond III. He didn't look like the man the government claimed he was, the mastermind of a drug empire, the architect of the crack crisis in Washington, D.C. That was the first weapon in his defense, the image of calm respectability. But across the aisle, the prosecution was ready to strip that image away. To them, this wasn't just another drug case. It was a reckoning. They had built their narrative with the patience of sculptors, shaping every detail to fit one picture. Rayful as the kingpin who had turned the nation's capital into the murder capital, flooding its streets with poison while building an empire worth millions. This trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about sending a message, both to the city and to anyone who might think of following in his footsteps. The opening arguments set the tone. The lead prosecutor spoke with measured conviction, his voice rising only at key moments. He described an organization that operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company and the ruthlessness of a paramilitary unit. He talked about multi-tier distribution, about lieutenants and runners, about stash houses and coded phone calls. But most of all, he talked about control, how every brick of cocaine, every dollar collected, and every corner claimed ultimately led back to one man. The defense countered with its own framing. Yes, Rayful was successful. Yes, he knew people in the drug trade. But success didn't make him guilty of every crime committed in the city. The defense painted him as a target of political pressure, a young man from a tough neighborhood who had been turned into a symbol of the crack epidemic simply because it suited the government's agenda. They hinted at flaws in the investigation, questioned the reliability of informants, and reminded the jury that much of the evidence was circumstantial. Then came the witnesses. Some walked into the courtroom with their heads low, avoiding eye contact with Rayful. Others looked straight at him, their expressions somewhere between defiance and regret. These were former associates, dealers, couriers, and even mid-level managers, many of them testifying under deals that could shorten their prison time. Their stories were detailed and, for the prosecution, damning. One described picking up kilos flown in from Los Angeles, wrapped so tightly that the scent of cocaine barely escaped. Another explained how money was counted in shifts, with rubber-banded stacks of bills packed into duffel bags and moved to safe houses under armed guard. Several testified about meetings where Rayful gave instructions in his quiet, deliberate way, never raising his voice, never wasting words, but making it clear that his word was final. The defense pushed back hard, attacking credibility. They asked about the deals these witnesses had made, suggesting they had every reason to lie. They pointed to inconsistencies in statements, differences between what was said in interrogation rooms and what was said on the stand. But the prosecution had anticipated this and used it to their advantage, showing that even with minor contradictions, the core details of the witnesses' accounts matched the surveillance, the wiretaps, and the physical evidence. One moment in particular gripped the courtroom. A former lieutenant, visibly nervous, recounted a night when a shipment was short and tensions ran high. He described the fear in the room, not because of yelling or threats, but because of the silence. Rayful had looked at the men, said almost nothing, and walked out. Hours later, the missing product was returned. No one ever asked how. The implication hung in the air like smoke. The wiretap recordings played next, their static and muffled voices drawing the jury in. Coded conversations about tickets, parties, and new shoes were matched with surveillance photos and dates of seizures. The translation of these codes into drug weights and cash amounts was laid out like a language lesson, each connection tightening the net. The prosecution also leaned on the numbers. They presented ledgers and testimony estimating profits at nearly $2 million a week at the height of the operation. They showed how that kind of revenue required not just supply and demand, but organization, discipline, and leadership at the highest level. They tied the violence of the era to the battle for control of territory, framing it as an inevitable byproduct of Rayful's rise. Outside the courtroom, the trial became a media spectacle. Headlines called it the trial of the century in D.C., and news cameras waited every morning to capture Rayful's arrival. Community opinions split sharply. Some saw him as a dangerous criminal finally facing justice. Others saw him as a product of the city's neglect, someone who had played the only game the streets offered and played it better than anyone else. Inside, the jury listened to weeks of testimony. They heard from law enforcement officers who had spent years on the case, describing the coordination between DEA, FBI, and MPD. They saw photographs of seized kilos, cash, and weapons. They listened to tapes of meetings in back rooms, where voices were low but the intent was unmistakable. The defense brought forward character witnesses, people from the community who spoke about the bills Rayful had paid, the events he had sponsored, the way he had helped families in need. They argued that these acts showed he wasn't the monster the government claimed. But the prosecution countered that generosity funded by drug money was not charity. It was control, a way to buy silence and loyalty while poisoning the same streets he claimed to protect. As the trial entered its final phase, the tension in the courtroom deepened. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The prosecution painted the image of a city under siege, its neighborhoods torn apart by an empire that answered to one man. They told the jury they had the chance to strike at the heart of that empire. The defense, on the other hand, warned against being swept up in the government's narrative, reminding the jury that the burden of proof was absolute. That doubt, any doubt, meant acquittal. The jury deliberated for days. Outside, the city waited. Reporters speculated, neighbors argued, and in the neighborhoods Rayful once controlled, people wondered what his fate would mean for the balance of power. When the verdict finally came, the air in the courtroom was thick enough to cut. The jurors filed in, faces unreadable. The clerk read the decision aloud, each word echoing in the silent room. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Count after count, the pattern repeated. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine, engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, and more. Rayful sat still, his expression calm, almost unreadable. Around him, some supporters wept quietly, while others stared at the floor. The prosecutors didn't cheer, but the satisfaction in their eyes was unmistakable. The government had its victory. But even as the courtroom emptied and the cameras outside scrambled to broadcast the news, there was an unspoken truth lingering in the air. A conviction was not the same as an ending. Empires didn't dissolve overnight, and power didn't vanish just because its leader was behind bars. The trial of the century in D.C. had delivered its verdict. Yet the question that hung over the city was the same one the task force had whispered about for months. With Rayful Edmond in custody, would the streets change, or would they simply find a new king? Chapter 19. Conviction and Sentencing. The weight of silence in a federal courtroom can be crushing. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the heaviness of dozens of people holding their breath at the same time. On the morning of sentencing, the room carried that weight. Lawyers shuffled papers without looking at each other. Journalists sat with notebooks ready, pens poised like weapons. And at the defense table sat Rayful Edmond III, hands clasped loosely, face unreadable. The verdict had already been delivered. Guilty, on all major counts. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise. Multiple related charges tied to the sprawling network he had built. The trial had been the public theater. This moment was the final act. And everyone in the room knew what was coming. The prosecution didn't need to argue for the maximum. The guidelines were clear. Federal sentencing for these crimes was designed not just to punish, but to erase. This wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about removing a man from the chessboard entirely, ensuring he could never again move pieces in the game that had turned Washington into a battlefield. Still, they spoke with precision. They recounted the scale of the operation, kilos shipped in by the hundreds, millions in cash moved like clockwork, streets controlled with quiet efficiency, and bursts of sudden violence. They described the impact on neighborhoods, families broken, young men buried, entire blocks consumed by addiction. The numbers were staggering, but it was the human cost they wanted to leave echoing in the judge's mind. The defense offered what it could. They reminded the court that Rayful had not been convicted of personally pulling a trigger. They spoke of his youth, how he had been barely in his 20s at the height of the empire. They mentioned the parts of his life that didn't fit the image of a kingpin, the generosity to neighbors, the support to family, the academic promise he once had. But even they seemed to know these arguments would land like stones skipping on the surface of a deep ocean. The current was already pulling toward one inevitable conclusion. When the judge spoke, his tone was steady, almost clinical. He cited the evidence, the testimony, the legal standards. And then, without pause, he delivered the sentence. Life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Not 40 years. Not 60. Life. The words hit the room like a gavel strike, even before the actual gavel fell. Rayful didn't flinch. He didn't look at the prosecution. He didn't turn toward the gallery, where family and friends sat frozen. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. It was the same composure he had carried through the trial, the same mask that had made him so hard to read in the streets. For his mother, the moment was different. She sat rigid, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, eyes fixed on the man at the center of it all. She had seen him rise, had seen him rule, and now she was watching him be erased from the city that had once seemed to belong to him. The sentence wasn't just the end of his freedom, it was the end of an era. In federal court, life without parole is exactly what it sounds like. There's no bargaining it down. No early release for good behavior. It's a legal lock with no key, designed to close forever. The law calls it incapacitation, removing the ability to commit further crimes. On the streets, it's called vanishing. Outside the courthouse, the cameras swarmed. Reporters delivered the news in quick, clipped sentences, some framing it as a victory in the war on drugs, others as a cautionary tale. They showed file footage of Rayful in his prime, smiling in courtside NBA seats, stepping out of luxury cars, moving through his neighborhood surrounded by friends and bodyguards. Then they cut to that morning's images, a man in a suit, escorted away in chains. In the neighborhoods he once controlled, the reaction was mixed. Some people celebrated, saying the sentence was justice for the chaos and destruction of the crack years. Others shook their heads, calling it a waste, a young man with intelligence and charisma who could have built anything, but chose the wrong empire. And then there were those who said nothing at all, their silence rooted in the knowledge that one man's fall doesn't end the game. Someone else would take his place. Back in the courtroom, as the proceedings ended, the marshals moved in. The chains were fastened around his wrists and ankles, the sound of metal clicking into place echoing off the walls. For the first time, the reality was visible. The man who had once walked into any room like he owned it now had to be led out by armed guards. He didn't look back as he was escorted away. The hallway outside was lined with federal agents, prosecutors, and court staff, some of whom had spent years chasing him. A few exchanged quiet nods. Others simply watched. No one spoke. It was a strange kind of victory, triumphant, but heavy. The transport van waited outside, its engine idling. He stepped inside without resistance, the door closing behind him with a final, hollow thud. The ride to the federal detention facility was short, but in that small, locked space, the world outside had already shifted. He was no longer a kingpin, no longer the college kid who had owned D.C. He was inmate number, another life swallowed by the system. Yet even as the van rolled toward its destination, the city he left behind was still living in his shadow. His network had been shattered, but not every connection had been cut. Not every dollar had been seized. Not every loyalist had been brought down. The sentence was the government's way of saying the chapter was closed. But anyone who knew the streets knew that chapters in this game rarely end clean. The judge's words would stay on the record forever, life without parole. It sounded like the end. But for Washington, D.C., the real question was just beginning. Would this sentence finally break the cycle? Or would the empire find a way to live on without its king? Chapter 20, Federal Prison Life. The first night inside a maximum security federal prison can feel like being dropped onto another planet. The sounds are different. The clang of steel doors, the hum of fluorescent lights, the muffled shouts echoing down concrete corridors. The air smells of bleach, metal, and something stale, like time itself has been trapped here too long. For most men, it's a shock that crushes the spirit. For Rayful Edmond III, it was a recalibration. He had walked into the institution with the same quiet confidence that had once carried him through DC's most dangerous corners. But here, status from the outside didn't mean safety. In prison, there are rules within rules, invisible lines you don't cross unless you want to test how quickly violence can erupt. It's a place where respect is currency, and the wrong word to the wrong man can cost you more than money. Rayful understood that faster than most. On the street, he had built an empire by reading people, watching their eyes, their posture, their hesitations. That skill didn't just survive behind bars, it sharpened. He studied the rhythms of the cell block the way he once studied the movements of his dealers. Who controlled the gambling tables? Who ran the kitchen hustles? Who had the guards in their pocket? Information was as valuable here as on the outside. But adjustment wasn't just about learning the power map. Federal time was different. This wasn't a local jail where a sentence might be measured in months or a few years. Life without parole meant no countdown to freedom. The days didn't tick away, they stacked endless, like bricks in a wall you could never climb. Some men broke under that weight, retreating into themselves or exploding in sudden bursts of rage. Rayful didn't break. He adapted. He quickly understood that his reputation had walked in the door before he did. Even inmates who had never set foot in D.C. knew his name. Stories about him had traveled, some true, some exaggerated. In a place where myth could be as powerful as fact, that reputation was a shield and a magnet. It drew respect from those who admired what he had built, and it drew the attention of those who saw taking him down as a way to raise their own standing. In prison, alliances were survival. Rayful wasn't a man to join a crew blindly, but he knew when to align with power. His connections, some stretching from the streets to international suppliers, gave him leverage. Word spread quickly that he could still make things happen, even from behind the walls. And in the unspoken hierarchy of federal prison, influence wasn't about who swung the sharpest blade. It was about who could pull strings without anyone seeing the threads. Money helped. Though the government had seized millions, not everything had been accounted for. Commissary accounts were topped up. Small comforts, a better pair of sneakers, extra food, the right brand of coffee, were never out of reach. In a place where deprivation was part of the design, those little luxuries had an outsized effect. They signaled that the man still had reach, still had resources, still mattered. And then there was communication. Prison walls are built to keep people in, but information moves through them like water through cracks. Rayful mastered that flow. Some messages moved through legal calls, others through coded letters, and some through human couriers, visitors who could carry a sentence or two back to the right ears on the outside. The network he'd once run in the streets evolved into something quieter but no less effective. Not all of his influence was shadow work. Inmates watched how he carried himself, never desperate, never frantic, always composed. In a place where fear was an open wound, that composure was a kind of armor. Younger inmates gravitated toward him, looking for guidance, or at least the illusion of it. He wasn't the kind of man to hand out lectures, but a sentence dropped at the right moment could shape how someone moved in the yard or handled a dispute. But prison wasn't without danger. Tensions simmered constantly. Disputes over debts, disrespect, or racial lines could ignite into violence without warning. Rayful wasn't untouchable here. Every man had to navigate the same daily risks, being in the wrong place when tempers flared, sharing space with men who had nothing left to lose. His protection was built on a combination of respect, calculated alliances, and the quiet understanding that retaliating against him would come at a steep cost. The isolation of federal time had its own kind of weight. Letters came from the outside, but they were fewer as the years passed. Friends who had once been constants faded into memory. The city kept moving, neighborhoods shifting, faces disappearing. Time in prison isn't just the absence of freedom, it's the slow erosion of the world you knew. Yet somehow, Rayful's name didn't fade. In D.C., his legend lingered, fueled by stories told in barbershops, whispered in corner conversations, or exaggerated in rap lyrics. To some, he was still the college kid who owned the city. To others, a cautionary tale carved into the concrete of the capital. Inside, he adjusted to routines. Wake-ups at dawn, count after count, the metallic taste of the air in the chow hall. Work assignments that felt pointless but passed the hours. He learned which guards could be worked with and which were best avoided. He learned to navigate the unspoken rules of the yard, where you could stand, where you couldn't, which benches belonged to which crews. And yet, through all of it, he maintained a level of influence that puzzled some and impressed others. Federal authorities knew he still had a reach beyond the walls, though proving it was another matter. In a place designed to strip a man of power, Rayful had found a way to keep a version of it alive. But the deeper truth was harder to see. The same discipline and intelligence that had built his empire were now tools for survival in a world with no exit. He could move pieces on the board, yes, but the board was smaller now, the stakes different. The game had changed, and winning here didn't mean freedom. It meant staying intact, physically, mentally, and in reputation. Years into his sentence, he had settled into a rhythm. Outsiders might see prison as a static place, But for those inside, it was a constantly shifting ecosystem. New arrivals brought fresh energy and new tensions. Old alliances dissolved. Opportunities appeared and vanished. Through it all, Rayful remained steady, his reputation still intact, his influence still present. Yet in the quiet hours, late at night, when the noise of the day had faded, there was the inescapable reality. This was forever. Life without parole meant that no matter how well he navigated the politics of the prison yard, no matter how much influence he kept, the gates would never open for him. The empire outside was gone. The city had moved on. And still, somewhere in the silence, there was the faintest sense that his story wasn't done. That even behind these walls, he had a role to play in the world beyond them. Because in the underworld, presence isn't always about being there. Sometimes, it's about the shadow you cast, even from a place you can never leave. Chapter 21. The Cooperation Decision. The choice was not made in the open. It wasn't the kind of decision a man like Rayful Edmond could discuss over a prison meal or in the noisy hum of the yard. It came quietly, in the narrow space between survival and surrender, in a place where every move could mean life or death. For years, he had kept the same posture he wore on the streets, unreadable, unshaken, untouchable. But in the sterile air of a federal interview room, under the dull hum of fluorescent lights, something shifted. Prison life had its own currency, and one of its most dangerous forms was information. To cooperate with law enforcement, to work with the people, as it was whispered, was a move that came with a price tag far heavier than money. On the streets, it was the ultimate betrayal, the kind of thing that could strip a man of his name, his respect, and his life. But here, in the deep corridors of the federal system, cooperation was also a tool, a way to reshape the game, even from behind walls. Rayful's network had been shattered by his conviction, but it wasn't erased. Threads still stretched out into the world beyond the prison gates. Old associates, loyal soldiers, and rivals who had filled the void. Some of those threads were pulling in dangerous directions, crossing into new territories, forging connections he hadn't authorized. For a man who had built his empire on control, that loss of oversight was more than frustrating. It was unacceptable. The first approach didn't come with an ultimatum. Federal agents had learned that a hard push could backfire with a man like him. Instead, they laid out facts. They told him about the rise of crews that had no loyalty to the old codes, about violent upstarts moving in with reckless abandon, about new connections linking the streets of D.C. to distant suppliers, threatening to ignite a wave of chaos worse than what had come before. And then, they asked questions. Not demands, not threats. Questions. At first, he listened without committing. Years in the game had taught him the value of silence. But as time went on, the conversations deepened. The agents weren't just fishing for names. They were building a map, and they knew he still held pieces of it in his head. Cooperation in the federal system is a delicate dance. Officially, it's called becoming a confidential informant, feeding intelligence to help dismantle criminal organizations. Unofficially, it's walking a knife's edge, balancing the demands of law enforcement with the reality that discovery could mean a death sentence. It requires secrecy layered over secrecy, coded communication, and the ability to live with the knowledge that every word could shift the fate of someone outside. Rayful's decision wasn't about chasing freedom. Life without parole meant that no matter how much he helped, the gates weren't swinging open for him. But there was another kind of freedom, the freedom to shape the board again, to influence who rose and who fell. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the layers of calculation, there was a recognition that the world he had helped build was eating itself alive. Once the decision was made, the process moved with the kind of precision only the federal system could orchestrate. Meetings took place in secure rooms, far from other inmates. Information was filtered through handlers who knew how to read between the lines. Sometimes it was as simple as confirming a name or a location. Sometimes it was more complex, a web of connections that needed untangling, a supply route traced back to its source. The work wasn't without its dangers. Even in prison, word had a way of leaking. Rumors could be as lethal as facts. A wrong look in the chow hall, A casual comment in the yard could mean someone was putting pieces together. And once suspicion took hold, it was almost impossible to shake. But Rayful moved with the same discipline he always had. He compartmentalized, keeping his cooperation invisible to those around him. To most inmates, he was the same man, quiet, composed, a figure whose reputation still carried weight. Behind that facade, he was playing a parallel game, one where the moves didn't play out in alleyways or street corners, but in sealed indictments and federal courtrooms hundreds of miles away. The information he provided didn't just chip away at small-time players. It reached into the upper tiers of trafficking networks, disrupting supply lines that fed entire cities. Some of the people taken down were men he had once done business with. Others were newer faces who had never met him but had risen in the space his absence had left. In both cases, the effect was the same, the quiet dismantling of pieces of the underworld, one move at a time. To law enforcement, he became a rare asset, a man with both the knowledge and the credibility to speak on worlds they couldn't enter. They valued his insights not just for the names and dates, but for the way he understood the logic behind the moves. To dismantle an empire, you need more than evidence. You need to think like the man who would build it. Still, there was an unspoken tension in every exchange. The agents knew they were dealing with a man who had once outplayed them, and he knew that trust in this relationship was transactional, built on the value of the information he delivered. In this arrangement, loyalty wasn't to people, it was to purpose. Outside the prison, the cases stacked up. Headlines announced major busts, but rarely mentioned his name. That was part of the deal. An informant's value dies the moment they're exposed. In the neighborhoods, the streets whispered, but no one could say for certain. In the world he came from, proof mattered more than rumor. And Rayful understood how to leave just enough uncertainty to keep himself insulated. Yet, even with all the secrecy, the decision carried a cost. In the culture of the streets, to cooperate was to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Whatever his reasons, whatever his results, the choice marked him. It was a mark that might never reach his body, but it would follow his name. Years passed, and his role remained buried beneath layers of redaction and sealed files. But the effects rippled outward. Networks that had seemed untouchable were fractured. Routes that had run steady for years went dark. The underworld adjusted, as it always does, but the adjustments carried the fingerprints of a man working from a locked cell. In the end, the cooperation didn't make him free. It didn't erase the sentence. It didn't return him to the streets he once ruled. But it did give him something else, a kind of power few men ever hold. The ability to reach across miles and years, to move in worlds he could no longer touch, to alter the shape of a game he was officially no longer in. And in that strange, quiet way, Rayful Edmond III remained what he had always been, an architect of outcomes, a man who could pull strings from the shadows. But in a game built on trust and reputation, one question lingered in the dark corners of both the prison and the city he once owned. When the full truth finally surfaced, would the shadow he cast be enough to protect him? Chapter 22, The Witness Protection Layer. It was the kind of rumor that didn't travel in the open. It moved in murmurs, in coded glances, in half-finished sentences. Someone would lean in at a corner store, lower their voice, and say they'd heard he wasn't just serving his time. He was protected. That maybe he'd slipped into a layer of the system most people never see. A place where names are erased, histories rewritten, and lives reshaped under the constant hum of secrecy. In the criminal world, witness protection is more than a program. It's a phantom state of existence. Officially, it's called the Witness Security Program, or WITSEC. Unofficially, it's an invisible city scattered across the country, populated by men and women who once knew too much, said too much, or agreed to trade information for survival. And in the case of someone like Rayful Edmond III, the speculation wasn't just about whether he'd entered that shadow world. It was about what that would mean for his legacy, his safety, and the fragile mythology that still clung to his name. Inside prison walls, the idea alone could be lethal. Inmates could forgive many sins, but crossing the code of silence was not one of them. If they believed he'd been placed under special federal protection, it wouldn't matter if the truth was different. Perception here was as dangerous as fact. And in prison, a rumor can kill faster than a knife. For law enforcement, the risks were obvious. Edmund had once been tied to networks that spanned cities and states, that connected street-level dealers to cartel pipelines. Helping him cooperate meant more than giving him a chair in a courtroom. It meant keeping him alive long enough to be useful. Every meeting with agents was a potential exposure point. Every time his name appeared in a sealed document, there was a chance it could leak. Even moving him between facilities required layers of security, like shifting a piece on a chessboard while every other player was watching. In WITSEC, the government builds a wall around its asset. That wall isn't made of bricks, it's made of silence. New names, hidden addresses, falsified histories. The program's success depends on disappearing a person so completely that even their own past can't find them. But prison complicates that formula. A man serving life without parole can't exactly be relocated to a suburb in Arizona with a new identity and a job at a hardware store. His walls are fixed. His name still exists in the inmate registry. And yet, there are layers of protection that can be woven even within concrete and steel. Restricted housing units, sealed visitation logs, special movements that keep him away from general population. Federal officials can create what is essentially a prison within a prison, a place where the only people who cross your path are those cleared to be there. The speculation about Edmund's protection grew because so few people could say for sure. Other inmates might notice that he was suddenly harder to find, that he seemed to vanish from the yard for days or weeks. Transfers could be explained away. Administrative moves happen all the time, but the pattern was unusual. To the men on the inside, unusual meant something was happening behind the curtain. On the outside, the whispers took on a different shape. People in D.C. argued about it in barbershops, at cookouts, on stoops. Some said the government would never protect a man like him, that he'd burned too many lives to be worth saving. Others claimed the opposite, that his value as an informant was so high, the feds would guard him like a national asset. To them, the fact that he was still breathing decades after his fall was proof enough. The truth about witness protection is that it's not just about saving someone's life. It's about protecting an investment. A cooperator who's still talking, still feeding intelligence, is worth far more alive than dead. For the government, losing such a source would mean losing years of work, contacts, and insight into worlds they can't otherwise touch. And Rayful wasn't just any cooperator. He was a blueprint of an entire era of the drug trade in the nation's capital. But protection has its own cost. It isolates. It locks a man deeper into the custody of the very system he once fought against. In prison, isolation can keep you alive, but it can also strip you down to the silence of your own thoughts. For someone like Edmund, who had once thrived in the constant motion of the streets, the stillness could be its own kind of punishment. Even so, the alternative was far worse. The risk wasn't just from old enemies, though there were plenty of those. It was from the shifting alliances of the present. In the underworld, grudges can last decades, but opportunity can spark violence overnight. A man might decide to strike not because of something Edmund had done to him, but because of what it might mean to be the one who did it. In that economy, a name like Edmund's could still be a currency. Some who knew him before his fall refused to believe he'd ever agree to such a thing. To them, cooperation was a line Rayful Edmond III would never cross. They clung to the image of him as a man who played the game to the end, no matter the odds. But legends are often more fragile than they appear. And when a man's survival is at stake, even the sharpest code can bend. The secrecy around his status became a kind of story in itself. The more the government refused to confirm or deny, the more the myth grew. Silence became the loudest answer, and in the world of crime, an unanswered question is more dangerous than a known truth. Witness protection, whether inside or outside prison, is built on the idea that invisibility is safety. But invisibility also erases. The more layers you put between a man and his old life, the more that old life begins to dissolve. People forget your voice. They stop recognizing your face. In time, even your name can lose its weight. For Edmund, that might have been the most dangerous risk of all, not dying, but fading. His story had been built on presence, on being seen, on shaping the city in ways no one could ignore. To be hidden away, reduced to a shadow of a rumor, was to trade a certain kind of power for a different kind. And yet, as the years went on, the speculation never stopped. His name still surfaced in conversations about the city's history, still drew arguments about loyalty, legacy, and survival. No matter how deep the layer of protection, no matter how far the government might have gone to shield him, one thing was certain: his story still belonged to the streets as much as it did to the files locked away in federal vaults. But the streets have long memories. And in that space between truth and rumor, between what the public knows and what it will never know, the question hangs like a shadow over his name. If the walls that protect him ever come down, what waits on the other side? Chapter 23: Collapse of the Empire. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single night when the streets of D.C. suddenly woke up free from the shadow of Rayful Edmond's empire. No clean break, no neat ending. The fall came in pieces, slow, jagged pieces, each one cutting away a part of what he had built. By the time the collapse was visible to everyone, the foundations had already been rotting for months, maybe years. The first signs were subtle. A corner where his people once stood was suddenly run by new faces. Not rivals yet, just opportunists, testing the waters, filling the space that arrests had left behind. The police raids, the indictments, the high-profile trial, each had chipped away at his control. But what truly weakened the empire was the silence. When the man at the top disappears, the chain of command bends, and eventually, it breaks. On the streets, power doesn't stay in one place for long. Without his voice directing the flow, without his rules, old alliances frayed. Mid-level lieutenants, once loyal to him, began carving out their own fiefdoms. Some took the crews they'd been running under his name and made them independent. Others linked up with suppliers who had no connection to Edmund at all. These were splinter crews, small, unpredictable, and hungry. And hunger on the streets is dangerous. When an empire breaks apart, the rules that once kept the chaos in check vanish. Rayful's organization had been ruthless, but it had been ordered. His word had been law. Disputes were settled quickly, often violently, but with purpose. Without that central authority, every slight became personal. Every corner became a battlefield. Violence began to spike. Not the quiet, surgical kind that kept order, but reckless shootings in broad daylight. Drive-bys that hit the wrong targets. Young crews making moves without thinking of the consequences. The city, already deep in the crack epidemic, became even more volatile. Murder scenes piled up faster than they could be processed. By the early 90s, D.C. wasn't just known as the nation's capital, it was branded the murder capital of America. The splintering of Edmund's empire had a ripple effect far beyond the crews themselves. Without his tight control over distribution, the quality of the product began to vary. Some dealers cut their supply heavily to stretch profits, feeding a market with weaker, more dangerous mixtures. Others, desperate to make a name for themselves, pushed purer, more potent crack, triggering waves of overdoses. The streets were unstable not just in territory, but in what they were selling. Law enforcement saw the chaos as both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, the dismantling of a centralized network meant no single crew had the resources Edmund's organization once commanded. On the other, the sheer number of small, violent players made it harder to track and predict the next flashpoint. Instead of one empire to target, they were chasing dozens of smaller fires burning across the city. For those who had lived under Edmund's rule, the change was complicated. Some remembered him as a man who kept the worst violence in check, who sponsored neighborhood events and paid bills when no one else would. Others saw him as the one who had set the stage for this chaos, whose empire had introduced the very product that was now tearing the city apart. In either case, his absence was felt in the way the streets moved. In prison, Edmund watched pieces of the story filter back to him. Reports came through coded conversations, through visits, through the steady stream of news that managed to reach even the most isolated inmates. He could hear the shape of his old world changing, feel the way it was slipping into something unrecognizable. Whatever influence he still had, it wasn't enough to hold it together. The splinter crews didn't just fight each other. They also began reaching out to new suppliers, some as far away as New York, Philadelphia, and even directly to West Coast connections. This shift broke the monopoly Edmund had once maintained. It also meant that old loyalties became meaningless. A man who had once sworn to never work with certain rivals was suddenly splitting a shipment with them if it meant holding onto a corner. And with each of these new arrangements came more risk. The old network had been disciplined in how it moved product, keeping law enforcement at bay through careful planning and strict rules. The new crews were sloppy. They flashed cash, wore the kind of jewelry that drew attention, bragged too loudly in places where the wrong ears could hear. It was only a matter of time before the arrests started stacking up again. But this time, there was no one to keep the replacements in line. The violence wasn't just business, it was personal now. Without a central figure to enforce truces or settle disputes, grudges became wars. Family members were targeted. Friends who had grown up together turned on each other. Entire neighborhoods became off-limits to those who had crossed the wrong crew. The city's map of danger shifted almost weekly. For the police, the collapse of Edmund's empire was both a success story and a grim reminder. They had taken down the biggest player in DC, but the game hadn't ended. In some ways, it had gotten worse. Centralized control had given way to unpredictable chaos. Arresting one man, even one as powerful as Edmund, couldn't erase the hunger that drove the drug trade, or the violence it fed. Meanwhile, for the older figures who had once operated alongside Edmund, the lesson was clear: the era of the Kingpin was dying. The streets were no longer built for one man to control. Too many eyes, too many guns, too much instability. Those who tried to step into his place often didn't last long. The ones who survived kept their profiles low, their operations smaller, their reach limited. But for the younger generation, those too young to remember Edmund's reign at its peak, the collapse wasn't a cautionary tale, it was an opening. To them, the chaos wasn't a problem. It was opportunity, a chance to make their own name in a city where the throne had been left empty. They didn't care about the old rules, the old loyalties, or the codes that had once shaped the game. They were building something different, something faster, flashier, and deadlier. And so, the city moved into a new phase of its underworld history. The empire was gone, but its echoes remained. In the money still flowing through certain blocks, in the weapons that still changed hands in shadowed alleys, in the stories still told about the man who had once run it all from the campus of a local college. The collapse was complete, but the damage was permanent. The city that had once been shaped by Edmund's discipline was now defined by the chaos his absence had unleashed. And somewhere in a federal prison cell, he was left with the same question the streets were asking. When an empire falls, does its shadow fade, or does it spread? Chapter 24, DC's Transformation. The city didn't breathe easier the day Rayful Edmond was locked away. If anything, the air in DC grew heavier. His empire was gone, but the crack epidemic he had helped supercharge still burned through neighborhoods like an unstoppable fire. The sound of gunfire still cut across the night, and the glow of police lights still painted brick walls in red and blue. But slowly, painfully, the game began to change. The fall of Edmund's network had been a public spectacle, a warning played out in real time. The raids, the trial, the sentence, it was all meant to send a message, not just to DC, but to every major city caught in the drug wars. No one is untouchable. And in Washington, that message hit harder than anywhere. The streets had just watched a man who seemed immune to consequence vanish into a life sentence. At first, it didn't change much. The younger crews, hungry for power, saw Edmund's absence as an invitation. Corners shifted hands, and the violence spiked as battles for territory played out in daylight. But the feds weren't leaving. The multi-agency task forces that had once focused on Edmund now widened their scope, using the same surveillance, wiretap, and informant tactics to sweep up the new generation. And it wasn't just the streets that changed, it was the law itself. In the years following Edmund's conviction, the federal government doubled down on the sentencing disparities between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. The ratio was staggering. Possessing or distributing just 5 grams of crack carried the same mandatory minimum as 500 grams of powder. Lawmakers claimed it was a direct response to the violence and devastation tied to the crack epidemic. Behind closed doors, Edmund's name was often used as a reference point, a case study of how a single network could devastate a city. For D.C., those laws were like a second wave of the storm. Suddenly, the streets weren't just dangerous. They were disappearing people at a scale never seen before. Young men, some barely out of high school, were being handed decades-long sentences for low-level crack offenses. Families were torn apart. Entire blocks lost generations to the prison system. The neighborhoods that had once been Edmund's strongholds began to empty of their young men, replaced by boarded-up row houses and silent streets. The drug trade adapted. The huge, industrial-scale operations of the 80s became rarer. Crews got smaller, more mobile, harder to track. They learned from Edmund's downfall, avoiding the kind of visibility and excess that had drawn so much attention to him. Transactions moved indoors, into cars, into the shadows. Violence didn't disappear, but it became more surgical, less flashy, designed to avoid police heat. Meanwhile, the city itself was shifting. By the mid to late 90s, the beginnings of gentrification started to creep into once feared neighborhoods. New money flowed in, not from the drug trade, but from developers and investors. Coffee shops replaced corner stores. Condos rose where open-air markets had once operated. But the scars of the crack era remained etched into the culture and memory of the people who had lived through it. The transformation wasn't clean. The laws that had been tightened in response to Edmund's empire didn't just target kingpins. They swept up low-level dealers and addicts in the same net. Critics argued that the crack powder disparity was rooted in racial bias, hitting black communities hardest. In D.C., a city with a majority black population at the time, the effect was devastating. The prison population swelled, and with it, the distance between those left on the outside and those locked away. Rayful Edmond's case became more than a crime story. It became a political talking point. Federal prosecutors pointed to his rise and fall as proof of the need for aggressive sentencing and relentless enforcement. Activists pointed to the devastation left behind as proof that the approach had failed. And in the middle of those arguments were the neighborhoods still trying to recover. For the law, Edmund's conviction was a victory. For the streets, it was a turning point. The days of one man openly running an empire with courtside NBA seats and high-end suits were over. In his place came a different kind of operator, quieter, harder to trace, less interested in fame than in survival. They weren't building empires. They were running survival games, moving product in smaller quantities, spreading risk across many hands. But the echoes of his reign never truly faded. Older hustlers told the new generation stories about the college kid who had once owned the city, about the rules he enforced, the order he maintained, the money he moved. They remembered the days when his network was so efficient that product moved like water through pipes. Constant, controlled, inevitable. And they remembered how it ended, in shackles, under a life sentence, his name etched into federal case law. The transformation of DC's drug trade was also a transformation of the city's identity. The 80s had given it a reputation for violence that clung to it like smoke. By the late 90s, the murder rate was slowly falling, but not because the city had healed. It was because the game had shifted. Dealers adapted to survive, and law enforcement learned to move faster, hit harder, and dig deeper. Every bust, every raid, every sentencing carried the shadow of Edmund's trial. Even years later, when Congress began to address the crack powder disparity, reducing the ratio from 100-1 to 18-1, it was too late for thousands who had already been sentenced under the old rules. In D.C., those laws had reshaped entire communities, and the legacy of those years still lingered in empty houses and missing faces. For the city, the transformation was double-edged. On one hand, the days of large-scale open-air drug markets and high-profile kingpins were gone. On the other, the human cost of dismantling those operations had been enormous. Federal crack laws had been a hammer, and in their swing, they had crushed far more than their intended targets. Through it all, Rayful Edmond's story remained a reference point, a symbol of both the heights of the crack era and the severity of its aftermath. His case had shown the government how to take down an empire. It had also shown the streets what it looked like when the crown was ripped away. And as DC pushed forward into the new millennium, building a new image on the rubble of its past, the question hung in the air like a whisper from another era. Had the city truly escaped the shadow of its most infamous kingpin, or had it simply learned to live within it? Chapter 25: The Cultural Memory. The city had changed, the corners had changed, but the name hadn't gone anywhere. In barbershops where the hum of clippers mixed with the low murmur of gossip, in rap verses traded through headphones on cracked metro seats, in half-whispered stories told on stoops, as the summer heat clung to brick walls, Rayful Edmond's legend lived on. For those who hadn't been there, the stories felt like myth. For those who had, they were memories burned into the bones. Even after decades behind bars, Rayful's name carried a charge in D.C. It was shorthand for a time when the city felt both dangerous and alive, when a kid barely out of his teens could command millions, run an operation as smooth as any corporation, and move through the streets with a mix of swagger and calculation. He had become more than a man. He was a symbol, an archetype, the young Kingpin image that would echo through music videos, street tales, and the imagination of anyone who thought they understood the game. His legend was fed by contradiction. On one side, he was remembered as the destroyer, responsible for flooding neighborhoods with crack, for the funerals and the violence that came with it. On the other, he was remembered as the benefactor, buying groceries for single mothers, paying rent for neighbors, sponsoring youth basketball teams. This split memory made him dangerous even in absence. He was proof that the streets could crown you and curse you in the same breath. The music kept him alive. Rappers from DC to New York dropped his name in verses like a knowing nod. In hip-hop, where street credibility and the myth of the self-made hustler hold currency, Rayful became a reference point, someone who had actually done what others only rapped about. His name carried the weight of authenticity, the kind that couldn't be manufactured. It was a badge of respect, even from artists who never met him, because his story fit perfectly into the larger narrative of the rise and fall outlaw. For younger listeners, the references were like a cipher they had to decode. Who was this man that Jay-Z mentioned? Why did his name come up alongside Pablo Escobar and Frank Lucas? Digging into the history, they found a story that felt almost cinematic. The college kid who ran the Capitol like a CEO, who dressed like Wall Street but ruled like a general, who seemed untouchable until the walls closed in. And it wasn't just the music. His image, his aura, crept into movies, TV shows, and novels about the drug game. Characters loosely based on him popped up in urban dramas. A kingpin with a clean smile and a sharp mind. A figure who could move in boardrooms and back alleys with equal ease. In documentaries and podcasts, his voice, calm, measured, intelligent, still caught people off guard. He didn't fit the stereotype of the reckless, gun-waving dealer. That was part of the fascination. He had rewritten what a kingpin could look like. But the legend came with distortion. Over the years, some stories inflated, others softened. His reign grew taller in the telling, his wealth more obscene, his reach more unstoppable. The facts became a skeleton draped in layers of street folklore. For some, he became almost a folk hero, stripped of the destruction his empire caused. For others, he remained the face of the crack years, a reminder of how quickly ambition could curdle into ruin. What made his legend so durable wasn't just what he did, but when he did it. The 80s were an era of excess, Wall Street money, designer brands, the birth of hip-hop's golden age. Rayful embodied that energy. He was DC's version of the fast life archetype, with the twist that his power came not from inherited wealth or corporate deals, but from the most dangerous hustle of them all. He turned street corners into cash machines and built a network that mirrored the efficiency of Fortune 500 companies. Older hustlers used his story as both inspiration and warning. They told young ones about his discipline, his control, his ability to make moves without letting emotions steer him. But they also told them about the ending, how no matter how high you climbed, the fall was always waiting. In that way, his legend became a moral lesson, though whether people took it as a cautionary tale or a blueprint depended on who was listening. In D.C., the places tied to his name became landmarks of a different kind. Blocks where his crews once posted up still carried whispers. Basketball courts where he showed up in gold chains and fresh sneakers became part of the lore. Even the courthouse where his trial unfolded became a place people pointed to, recalling the day the city's most infamous son stood before a judge and heard the words that would lock him away for life. The media had played its part in shaping the myth. News anchors in the late 80s spoke his name with a mix of fear and fascination, their voices heavy with the implication that he was more than just another dealer. The scale of his operation, the flash of his lifestyle, the youth of his face, it all fed into a narrative that the public couldn't look away from. And decades later, those old clips still circulated, fueling a new generation's curiosity. Some people resented the way his name lingered, feeling it romanticized a man who had brought so much harm. Others saw it as unavoidable. Every city has its outlaw icon, the one figure whose story becomes inseparable from the place itself. For Washington, Rayful Edmond was that figure. His name was etched into the city's cultural DNA, as impossible to erase as the crack years themselves. Even behind bars, his influence found strange ways to stretch forward. Interviews from prison showed a man older, more reflective, but still sharp. In them, he spoke about choices, about consequences, about the mistakes that can come when you believe your own invincibility. For some, these were glimpses of redemption. For others, they were just another layer to the myth, a Kingpin now recast as a wise elder of the game. The young Kingpin archetype he embodied didn't die with his arrest, it became a template. In the years after his fall, countless hustlers in cities across America tried to follow the same path. Build fast, spend big, stay untouchable. Most ended up the same way, locked up or dead before 30. But the idea remained seductive, especially to those who grew up in the shadow of poverty, where legitimate paths to wealth seemed impossible. The danger of a legend is that it keeps breathing long after the man is gone. In Rayful's case, it became a mirror. Some looked into it and saw ambition, intelligence, and style. Others saw greed, recklessness, and destruction. Both were true, and that tension is what kept people talking. The city moved on. The streets changed, the buildings changed, the people changed. But on certain nights, when the air was thick and the streets were quiet, the stories came back. About the college kid who once owned D.C. About the man who walked both sides of the line until the ground gave way. About the name that still, decades later, could make people lower their voice and lean in a little closer. Because in Washington, D.C., some legends never fade. They just go quiet, waiting for the next person to ask, "You ever hear about Rayful Edmond?" Chapter 26, Family and Fallout. It began with the sound of doors slamming, steel on steel, wood on wood, echoing across neighborhoods where everyone knew the names of the people being taken away. The morning after Rayful Edmond's fall wasn't quiet. It was filled with police radios crackling, the low hum of unmarked cars parked on corners, and the shuffle of agents walking family members and associates out of houses that had once been untouchable. In those hours, you could feel the city exhale, but it wasn't relief. It was the uneasy breath of people who knew the storm had broken, but the damage was far from over. Rayful's arrest hadn't been a single stone dropped into still water. It was a boulder hitting the center of a pond, sending ripples that became waves, pulling everyone close to him into the undertow. For his family, it was a tearing apart not just of bloodlines, but of livelihoods. His mother, already infamous for her own role in the street economy, faced the same relentless scrutiny as her son. Houses were raided, assets seized. The bank accounts that once hummed with cash from hand-to-hand sales and wholesale drops went silent overnight. For years, they had been the power behind closed doors. Now, they were headlines. The family dinners that once brimmed with laughter, expensive liquor, and quiet boasts about the week's numbers were replaced by prison visits under fluorescent lights. Conversations were shorter now, words measured, eyes darting to the guards standing a few feet away. Every hug goodbye carried the unspoken question, "Will I see you again on this side of the wall?" For his associates, the collapse was even faster. Men who had been lieutenants in his operation, trusted with entire neighborhoods, entire supply chains, found themselves scattered. Some went to prison within weeks, swept up in the same federal dragnet. Others tried to step into the void Rayful left, but the math had changed. The steady pipeline of pure product was gone. The discipline Rayful enforced, the rules that kept certain lines from being crossed, evaporated. Without his presence, crews turned on each other. Corners became battlefields again, and the murder rate, already sky-high, climbed even further. A few tried to disappear completely. They moved out of D.C., shaved their heads, changed their names. But the game has a long memory. Old debts, old grudges, and old business followed them like shadows. More than one was found years later, lying cold in a parking lot or slumped over a steering wheel, a quiet reminder that in this world, there is no true retirement. The fallout didn't stop with friends and family. It reached rivals, too. For years, competing crews had tried to chip away at Rayful's empire, often failing under the sheer weight of his supply and the loyalty he commanded. When he fell, they saw opportunity. Corners once locked down under his watch became open ground, and the rush to claim them was violent. Gunfire returned to blocks that had been under tight control, not because Rayful kept the peace out of kindness, but because chaos was bad for business. Now, without his grip, chaos was back in full force. Some rivals celebrated his fall openly, bragging in bars and on corners that the king was gone. Others were more cautious. They knew the kind of loyalty Rayful inspired, and they feared retaliation from his remaining soldiers. But loyalty without leadership is fragile. Within months, even his most faithful lieutenants were either locked up, dead, or making side deals to survive. The empire didn't just crumble, it disintegrated. The federal government made sure it stayed that way. The case against Rayful had been a showcase, and now they used it as a blueprint. They followed the same playbook with other high-level dealers, build a web of informants, plant wiretaps, hit with coordinated raids. For anyone who had been close to him, family, friend, or rival, federal eyes stayed on them for years. Phones were tapped, mail intercepted, cars followed. The message was clear. There would be no rebuilding, no second rise. For his siblings and cousins, the shadow of his name was a double-edged sword. In some circles, it brought respect, even decades later. In others, it was a curse, doors closed, jobs denied, opportunities lost because their bloodline was tied to one of the most infamous drug cases in U.S. history. Some tried to live quietly, raising families far from the neighborhoods where the Edmund name still carried weight. Others leaned into the notoriety, trading on the story, telling their version of events to anyone who would listen. The emotional toll was harder to measure. Prison time for a son or brother is one thing. Prison time for a provider is another. Families who had relied on the money flowing through Rayful's operations suddenly faced the cold math of bills and no income. Apartments were lost, cars repossessed, children pulled out of private schools. The same streets Rayful had once shielded them from were now the ones they had to survive in. For the women tied to him, mothers of his children, girlfriends, even casual flings, the fallout came with its own dangers. Some were called to testify, pressured by prosecutors who dangled immunity in exchange for information. Others became targets for enemies looking to hurt Rayful by hurting the people he cared about. Trust, already a fragile currency in the drug world, evaporated completely. Even years later, when the crack era had given way to new drugs and new players, the aftershocks of his fall could still be felt. Some former associates adjusted, finding legitimate work, building businesses far from the corner hustle. Others couldn't escape the pull of the streets and ended up back in the same cycle. Arrest, release, arrest, until the game finally took everything from them. The most chilling part of the fallout wasn't what happened in the months after his arrest, but what happened in the years that followed. Without Rayful's centralized control, the drug trade in D.C. fractured. Instead of one dominant network with rules, there were dozens of smaller crews, each with its own code, or no code at all. Violence became less predictable, more random. The killings that once had purpose, at least in the cold logic of street business, turned into killings over insults, over nothing. In some ways, the city became even more dangerous without him. The press rarely covered these slow-motion consequences. To them, the Rayful story ended with the sentencing, life without parole. But for the people still living in the neighborhoods he once ruled, the story kept going. The empty houses where his crews once operated became squats or shooting galleries. The basketball courts he'd funded uniforms for fell into disrepair. The kids he once handed crisp bills to on Christmas grew up in a city that remembered the gifts, but also the funerals. His fall had also taught the next generation of hustlers a lesson, though not the one law enforcement hoped for. They saw that the empire fell not because of bad business, but because of the spotlight. Rayful had been too visible, too flashy, too public. The smart ones learned to move quieter, to keep their faces out of the papers, to let someone else be the name while they pulled the strings from the shadows. The federal task forces kept catching kingpins, but the game adapted. By the time the 90s rolled into the 2000s, most of Rayful's old crew were ghosts, dead, locked away, or vanished into other cities. But the city's collective memory of them lingered. In the same breath, someone could tell you about the day federal agents swarmed their block and about the summer cookouts when Rayful's money paid for free food and music. That's how complex the fallout was. It didn't fit neatly into good or bad. It was a wound that left a scar, but also a story people couldn't stop telling. For the Edmund family, the years after his fall were a slow process of living with that scar. Some tried to redefine the name, to build new lives that had nothing to do with the street empire that had made it famous. Others held on to the past, insisting that Rayful's legacy was more than the headlines said. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between, a truth buried under years of loyalty, betrayal, grief, and survival. And still, in quiet moments, people close to him wondered if it could have gone differently. If he'd stayed in school, if he'd kept the operation smaller, if he'd left the city before the heat got too hot. Those questions had no answers, but they hovered in the air, whispered over prison phones, spoken in hushed tones at family gatherings. Because even after the empire was gone, even after the government made sure it could never rise again, one thing remained: the shadow of Rayful Edmond. It was a shadow long enough to stretch over years, long enough to touch every person who had ever been in his orbit. And for some, that shadow would never lift. The story of his rise had been about ambition, calculation, and control. The story of his fall was about survival. Who could adapt, who could disappear, and who would be swallowed whole by the game they once thought they ruled. But there was still one chapter left, one question that even decades later made people lean forward when it was asked. What happens when the most feared name in the city is gone, but the legend refuses to die? Chapter 27. Lessons in Power and Destruction. The photograph is grainy now, but you can still make out the smile. A young man in a tailored suit, no older than 24, leaning against the hood of a foreign car, eyes sharp with ambition. Behind him, the city he would own, for a time, unfolds in blurred outlines. It's the image of triumph, but what the picture doesn't show is the cost. Not just to him, not just to the people who stood closest to him, but to entire blocks, entire families, entire generations who would never be the same. In the quiet aftermath, when the guns stopped firing and the courtrooms emptied, Washington, D.C. was left with a question it still struggles to answer. How does a city produce a figure like Rayful Edmond? And more importantly, what does it lose in the process? The truth is, it begins long before the headlines. In neighborhoods where opportunity doesn't knock, it slides a note under the door. Where ambition is real but the pathways to channel it are crumbling. The schools are underfunded, jobs scarce, streets policed but not protected. In that environment, the streets aren't just a temptation. They're a classroom. And the lesson is simple. If you can move fast, think faster, and keep your circle tight, you can build something bigger than anyone thought possible. For Rayful, that lesson took root early. He studied people the way a chess player studies the board, seeing moves before they happened, anticipating betrayal before it came. It's a skill that in another life might have made him a CEO, a politician, a mogul in a boardroom instead of a back alley. But in the world he chose, it made him a kingpin. And yet, the same qualities that built his empire became the seeds of its destruction. Fast money demands faster risks. Power built on fear demands constant proof of strength. In the drug trade, you're not just climbing a ladder. You're running up a collapsing staircase, each step behind you falling away. Sooner or later, you run out of steps. The allure of fast money isn't hard to understand. In a matter of months, a teenager from a modest row house could be wearing $1,000 suits, driving imported cars, handing out cash like candy. It was intoxicating, not just for the people inside the game, but for those watching from the sidelines. Kids on the block didn't see the jail cells or the morgues. They saw the jewelry, the parties, the women, the respect. They saw someone from their world break free of the rules that held everyone else down. But the cost of that illusion was staggering. For every corner Rayful controlled, there were mothers burying sons, addicts losing homes, children learning that fear was the only form of order. Crack cocaine didn't just kill, it corroded. It ate away at trust between neighbors, at the fabric of families, at the possibility of a future untouched by the game. And once that trust is gone, rebuilding it takes more than laws or money. It takes time, a currency the victims didn't have. Rayful's story is a mirror with two sides. On one side, it's the story of raw ambition, of a young man who outmaneuvered older, more established players and built a criminal empire on a scale the city had never seen. On the other, it's a cautionary tale about how that kind of power always demands a price. The streets may crown you, but they'll never let you keep the throne. In court, the prosecutors called him the architect of DC's crack crisis. On the streets, some still called him a hero. Both views hold pieces of the truth, but neither tells the whole story. The reality is more complicated. He was a product of his environment and a master of it. A man who understood the rules so well he could bend them to his will, but who couldn't escape the one rule that governs them all. In the game, everyone loses eventually. The irreversible cost wasn't just measured in bodies or prison years. It was measured in the culture that grew up around him. In the music, in the movies, in the mythology of the young Kingpin. His name became shorthand for a certain kind of success, fast, dangerous, and fleeting. Artists rapped about him, hustlers studied him, kids still whispered about him decades later. The legend became untouchable, even as the man himself lived behind bars. That's the paradox. The same legend that warns about the dangers of the life also seduces people into chasing it. The flash, the money, the respect, it's a story as old as crime itself. But the ending, no matter how it's dressed up, is always the same. Prison, death, or both. If there's a lesson in Rayful's story, it's that power without permanence is just a performance. And in the world he ruled, every performance has an encore, one you don't choose. The encore is the knock at the door in the middle of the night, the click of handcuffs, the slow walk into a federal courtroom. The encore is your name being spoken in past tense, while the city you once owned moves on without you. But there's another lesson, one harder to face. The fall of a figure like Rayful doesn't fix the conditions that created him. His arrest didn't end the drug trade in DC. It didn't end poverty, or erase the scars left by decades of neglect. It just created a vacuum, and the streets abhor a vacuum. Others stepped in. The names changed, the drugs changed, but the cycle stayed the same. And that's where the real destruction lies, not just in what one man did, but in what the system allowed to happen long before he made his first move. It's easy to point at a kingpin and say, here's the problem. It's harder to ask why his empire was possible in the first place. Even now, the story of Rayful Edmond is told with a mix of awe and caution. Some tell it like a warning, others like a legend. But the truth lies somewhere in between. a story of potential turned into peril, of a city caught between admiration and devastation. The image of that young man in the suit remains frozen in time. Behind the smile is a story of streets that raised him, a city that shaped him, and choices that defined him. Behind the smile is the weight of every life touched by his rise and fall. And in the end, that's the part of the story that never changes. The streets remember, the families remember, the city remembers, and memory, like power, is something you can't control once it's out in the world. Somewhere tonight, in a corner of DC, a young kid will hear the name Rayful Edmond for the first time. Maybe in a song, maybe in a story from an older relative. He'll hear about the money, the respect, the way one man owned the city. He won't hear about the funerals right away. He won't see the prison walls, the lonely years, the people left behind. Not yet. And that's the danger. Because until the whole story is told, the rise and the ruin, the ambition and the aftermath, the cycle will keep spinning, and the next young king will already be on his way up the collapsing staircase. The question is, when the crown falls again, will anyone be ready to catch it?